Hey there, and welcome back. If you have come here at the end of a long day, with the lamp turned low and the house gone quiet around you, then you have found your way to exactly the right place, and there is nothing more for you to do tonight but settle and breathe and let yourself be carried gently away into another time. Tonight we are going to keep company with the last of them, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, the one who outlived him, and whose story is, in a way, the happiest and the most remarkable of all the six, though it has its sorrows too. You may know her, if you know her at all, by the single word that the old rhyme gives her. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. She is the one who came through, the one who was still standing when the old king finally died, and for centuries that was nearly all that was remembered of her, that she was the wife who got away. But there was so very much more to this woman than her survival, and that is what I want to show you tonight. For she was the most learned of all his wives, a true scholar, the first woman in all of England to publish a book under her own name. She was a woman of profound faith and true courage, who came within a hair's breadth of the scaffold for her beliefs and saved herself by her own wit and nerve. She was a loving stepmother who helped to mend a broken royal family, and she was a woman who, having survived the most dangerous husband in the world, reached at the very end for a happiness of her own, and found it and lost it in the space of a single year. She was not merely the finest, perhaps, of them all. Before we go back across the centuries to find her, let me say the small things I always like to say at the start. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, whether there is rain at the glass, or snow on the sill, or only the soft dark of a late and silent hour. If you find a kind of peace in these slow journeys into the past, then you are very welcome to subscribe, so that the next of these long evenings finds its way to you when you have need of one, and you are always welcome to leave a note in the comments, for I look through them often, and there is a soft joy in seeing how a story 5 centuries old can gather people together from every corner of the earth into the same hushed and shared and sleepy room at the close of the day. That is all. The lamp is low, the door is shut, and the night belongs to you. So let your shoulders drop, and let the day loosen its hold, and come back with me now to the north of England, almost 500 years ago, to a family of the rising gentry, and a clever little girl with a queen's name. Picture this. The green and rolling country of the English north, in the years just after 1510, a land of broad dales and stone-built villages, of sheep on the high fells and rivers running cold and clear through the valleys, of old churches and older families holding their land as their forebears had held it for generations. It is a country somewhat apart from the glittering life of the court far to the south, prouder and harder and more conservative, where the powerful families ruled their wide estates like minor kings, and the old ways held firm against the changes blowing up from London. And among the gentry families of this northern country, neither the greatest nor the least were the Parrs, a respectable and rising house, well connected and ambitious, with one foot in their northern lands and one increasingly at the court of the king. They were not a grand family in the way the Howards were grand, not dukes or earls with royal blood, but they were solid and capable and on the rise, the kind of family that produced able servants of the crown and made advantageous marriages and climbed, generation by generation, a little higher. And it is into this family, sometime around the year 1512, that the little girl we are following tonight was born, and given, in honour of the Queen her mother served, the name Catherine. To understand her you must begin with her mother, for Maud Parr was an exceptional woman in her own right, and she shaped her daughter's character and her destiny more than anyone else alive. Maud had been widowed young, left a widow in her early 20s when her father died, with 3 small children to raise and an estate to manage, and she had done it all herself, refusing to remarry, devoting her life to her children and their advancement. She was a lady of unusual capability and determination, and she had a connection that would prove enormously important, for Maud Parr was a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, to Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, the Spanish princess, who was then still Queen of England, and still, it seemed, secure upon her throne. Maud served that queen faithfully, was close to her, admired her, and it was for that queen that Maud named her own little daughter, so that the child grew up bearing the very name of Catherine of Aragon herself, a small thread connecting the first of Henry's wives to the last. The Queen Maud served to the queen her daughter would become. There is something almost poetic in it, that the woman who would be his 6th and final wife was named for his first, the long wheel of his marriages coming round at the last to close where it had begun, in the name of a little northern girl. Let me tell you more about the family that made Catherine, for the Parrs were a particular kind of family, and their character and their fortunes shaped the woman she became. They were not ancient nobility, with castles and royal blood, but they belonged to that immensely important class, just below the peerage, the gentry, who formed the backbone of the realm and the chief servants of the crown. The Parrs had their roots in Westmorland and the surrounding country, where they had held their standing for generations, a solid and respected house among the lesser lords of those parts. But they were a rising family, ambitious and capable, and like many such families they had begun to look southward, toward the court and the king, where real advancement was to be found, sending their sons and daughters into royal service, making the marriages and the connections that might lift them higher. Her own father, Sir Thomas Parr, had been a courtier, a man close to the young King Henry in the early days of his reign, well-placed and well-favoured, and it was through his court connections that the family's fortunes were tied to the throne. The early death of her father, when she was only about 5 years old, might have been a disaster for such a family, for the loss of the father who held the family's connections and managed its affairs could easily have meant decline and obscurity. That it did not, that the Parr children grew up to make brilliant careers and fine marriages, was due almost entirely to their remarkable mother, Maud, who held the family together and drove its advancement through sheer determination and skill. Widowed young, she might have remarried, might have passed her children's futures into other hands, but she chose instead to devote herself wholly to them, to remain a widow, and to make it her life's work to raise her children well and advance them in the world. She managed the family's estates, guarded its interests, maintained its court connections, and above all she educated her children and sought out the marriages and the positions that would carry them upward. It was a formidable achievement, the work of a strong and capable woman in an age that gave women little scope for such things, and it shaped Catherine profoundly, for she grew up with the example before her every day of what a determined and capable woman could achieve, even alone, even widowed, even in a world built to constrain her. Her brother and sister both rose high through their mother's care and their own abilities, and their fortunes were closely bound with her own throughout her life. Her brother, William Parr, became a significant figure at court, advancing steadily, eventually rising to high noble rank, a man of influence in the reigns that followed. Her sister, Anne Parr, made a good marriage and served at court, becoming one of the Queen's ladies, present throughout her queenship, a close companion and support. The 3 Parr children, raised by their widowed mother in the north and launched by her into the world, formed a close and mutually supportive family, rising together, helping one another, their fortunes intertwined. And when she rose highest of all, becoming queen, she carried her family up with her, advancing her brother and her sister, surrounding herself with her own kin, the close family bonds that had sustained her through her early years continuing to sustain her at the summit of her fortune. The Parrs were a family that rose together, and she was the brightest jewel of their rising. There is something representative about the Parrs, something that makes their story a window onto the changing England of their age, for they were exactly the kind of family that was rising in Tudor England, the capable, ambitious, well-educated gentry who were increasingly the real engine of the kingdom. The old feudal nobility, the great families with their private armies and their semi-royal pretensions, were being tamed and diminished by the Tudor monarchy, while families like the Parrs, who served the crown with their administrative skill and their education rather than their swords, were rising to take their place. Her eventual elevation to the throne, a woman of the gentry becoming Queen of England, was itself a sign of this great social shift, of a world in which ability and education and royal favour could carry a family from the northern dales to the very summit of the kingdom. She was a new kind of queen for a new kind of age, not a foreign princess or a grand noblewoman, but a gentlewoman of learning and capability. And in her rise we can see the shape of the future, the rise of the educated, capable, serving class that would increasingly run England in the centuries to come. But it was not only her name that Maud gave her daughter. It was something far more valuable and far more unusual, which was a true education, for Maud Parr believed, in an age that mostly did not, that daughters as well as sons should be taught, should have their minds trained and furnished, should learn more than the needle and the household arts that were thought sufficient for women. Well, Maud established a kind of little school in her own household for her own children and the children of other families, and there Catherine and her sister and brother were taught alongside their companions, given a grounding in letters and languages and learning that was rare indeed for daughters of that age. This early education planted in Catherine a love of learning that would grow throughout her life into something remarkable, for she became, in time, one of the most genuinely learned women in England, a reader and a thinker, and eventually a writer, fluent in languages, steeped in the questions of faith that were convulsing her age. It all began here, in her mother's household school in the north, with a clever little girl given the rare gift of a trained mind, and that gift would carry her, in the end, further than anyone could have dreamed, all the way to the throne, and to a place in history as a woman of letters that none of Henry's other wives could claim. To understand what was truly remarkable about Catherine Parr, you have to understand how unusual it was for a woman of her age to be learned at all, for the education of women was a contested and difficult thing in Tudor England, and she stood at the very forefront of a small and pioneering movement. For most of history, and certainly in the England of Catherine's birth, the schooling of girls was thought largely unnecessary and even undesirable. A woman's role was domestic, it was held, confined to the management of a household and the bearing and raising of children, and for such a role she needed no learning, no languages, no philosophy, only the practical skills of housewifery, and perhaps enough reading to follow her prayers. Learning in a woman was regarded by many with positive suspicion, as something unnatural, even dangerous, likely to make her proud and unruly and unfit for her proper subordinate place. The idea that a girl should be given the same rigorous education as a boy, trained in languages and letters and the major works of learning, was to most people simply absurd, a waste of effort on a creature incapable of profiting from it, and better kept to her needle. But in her lifetime, a new idea was stirring, born of the vast intellectual movement we call the Renaissance, the rebirth of classical learning that was transforming the intellectual life of Europe. Among the humanist scholars who led this movement, there were some who argued, radically for their age, that women too were capable of learning, that daughters as well as sons could and should be educated, that a woman's mind was as fit for cultivation as a man's. This was still very much a minority view, and even those who held it usually imagined female learning as a private accomplishment rather than a public role. but it created, here and there, in advanced and enlightened households, the possibility of a true education for girls, and she, through her remarkable mother, was one of the fortunate few to receive one. Maud Parr, ahead of her time, believed in educating her daughters, and the little school she established in her household gave Catherine a grounding that set her apart, a trained mind, a love of learning, a foundation on which she would build throughout her life into genuine scholarship. And she did build on it all her life, for she was not content with the modest accomplishments thought sufficient even for an educated woman, but pursued learning with a genuine and growing passion. She read widely and deeply, especially in works of devotion, the hardest questions of faith and scripture that were convulsing her age. She studied languages, improving her Latin, even taking up the study of new tongues as queen. She surrounded herself with scholars and educated women and engaged with them as an equal in the intellectual life of her time. And she became, in the end, not merely learned but a genuine contributor to the learning of her age, a writer whose books were read and valued, a patron of scholarship, a figure of real intellectual importance. In an age that thought women incapable of serious learning, she proved the thought false by her own example, becoming one of the most genuinely educated and intellectually accomplished people of her entire age, and showing what a woman's mind could do when it was given the chance to grow. The significance of this extended far beyond herself, for as queen she became a powerful patron and exemplar of female learning, and her influence helped to advance that cause in England. She encouraged the education of the royal children, including her stepdaughters, fostering in the young Elizabeth especially a rigorous education that would make her one of the most learned monarchs ever to sit on the English throne. She gathered scholars and educated ladies around her, made her court a place where female learning was valued and encouraged, set an example at the very summit of society of what a schooled mind could be. In doing so, she helped, in her quiet way, to shift the attitudes of her age, to make the schooling of her sex a little more thinkable, a little more respectable, to plant seeds that would grow in the generations that followed. The clever girl from the northern schoolroom became, as queen, a champion of the very cause that had made her the schooling of women, and her example and her influence rippled outward through her age and beyond, one of the quieter but more important of her many legacies. She showed her world that a woman could think, and learn, and write, and even govern, and that example was itself a kind of revolution. Before ever she came to the king, she had already lived a whole life, had already been a wife and a widow not once but twice, and it is worth following those early marriages, for they made her the capable and seasoned woman that Henry would eventually choose. Like all women of her class, she was married young, by arrangement, her mother seeking a suitable match for her clever daughter. The first husband chosen for her, when she was around 17, was a youth named Edward Burrough, the son of a northern gentry family much like her own. It was a respectable match, sensible and unremarkable, and she went to live with her husband and his family. But the marriage was brief, for Edward Burrough was sickly, or at least short-lived, and within a few years he was dead, leaving Catherine a widow before she was 20, a woman already once married and once bereaved, but still without children, still at the very beginning of her adult life. It was an unremarkable beginning, this first brief marriage, a small quiet chapter that ended almost before it began, but it taught her something of what it was to run a household and be a wife, and it left her free, young, still, to be married again. Her second marriage was a weightier affair, and it shaped her far more deeply, for it made her, for the first time, the mistress of a large house and the stepmother of another woman's children. The husband chosen for her this time was John Neville, Lord Latimer, a northern nobleman of an old and considerable family. a widower more than twice her age with 2 children from his previous marriages. It was a significant step up for Catherine, a marriage into the nobility, and it placed the woman, still only in her early 20s, at the head of a large noble household, the Lady of Snape Castle in Yorkshire, responsible for a large establishment and for the raising of her husband's offspring. And here Catherine discovered, it seems, a true gift, for she became a devoted and capable stepmother, winning the affection of Latimer's offspring, managing his establishment with skill, growing into the role of a noble lady with a competence and a warmth that would later serve her so well in a far grander household. She was learning in these years all the arts she would one day need, how to run a great house, how to be a stepmother to offspring not her own, how to be a nobleman's wife and the mistress of a castle, and she was learning them well. Let us return in fuller detail to the first real peril of her life, the northern rising that we call the Pilgrimage of Grace, for it was the ordeal that first tested her courage and first revealed the steadiness that would later save her life, and it deserves to be told more fully. The Pilgrimage of Grace was the greatest popular rebellion of Henry's reign, a vast rising of the north of England in the autumn of 1536, and it sprang from the deepest grievances of the northern people against the king's upheaval of faith. Back with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the assault on the old faith and the old ways, had stirred deep anger and fear in the conservative north, where the old religion held firm and the monasteries were woven into the fabric of life. And in the autumn of that year, the North rose in its tens of thousands, a vast popular movement demanding the restoration of the old faith and the reversal of the king's religious changes, the largest and most dangerous challenge that Henry ever faced to his rule. Lord Latimer, Catherine's husband, was caught in the very heart of this dangerous revolt in a position of terrible difficulty, and his predicament placed his whole family, Catherine among them, in mortal jeopardy. As a northern lord, Latimer was expected by the rebels to support them, to lend them his name and his leadership, and the pressure upon him to join the rebels was intense and dangerous to refuse. But to join a rebellion against the king was treason, punishable by the most terrible death, and Latimer knew that if he supported the rebellion he risked everything, while if he refused he risked the fury of the rebels. He was trapped between the rebels and the king, in an impossible position, and he was forced, more or less against his will, to take part, to go along with the rebels, lending them his leadership under duress. It was a desperately perilous course, for it associated him and his family with treason, and when the revolt was eventually put down, it left him under deep suspicion, his life and his lands, and his family's whole future hanging in the balance. And in the chaos and danger of these events, she was caught up directly in the violence, for at one point the rebels, or a band of them, seized Snape Castle, the family's home, and held Catherine and the children there. Imagine the terror of it. The young woman trapped in her own home, surrounded by armed and angry rebels, her husband caught up in the perilous revolt, her family's future in peril, the violence of a vast rebellion swirling all around her. She had her stepchildren to protect, the household to manage, her own fear to master, all in the midst of a volatile and unpredictable situation that could have turned to violence at any moment. It was a true and mortal peril, the kind that most people never face, and it tested Catherine's courage and steadiness to the utmost, demanding that she keep her head and keep the children safe in the midst of chaos and threat. And she came through it, endured the terror, protected the children, held steady until the danger passed, revealing in that ordeal the courage and the nerve that were such a deep part of her character. The rising was eventually suppressed, brutally, with terrible reprisals, many of its leaders executed, the king's vengeance falling heavily on the north that had defied him. Lord Latimer, by careful manoeuvring and good fortune, managed to escape the worst, to make his peace with the king, to save his head and his lands, though he remained under suspicion, and the strain of those dangerous events seems to have broken his health and hastened his death. For Catherine, the ordeal of the Pilgrimage of Grace was a formative experience, her first real encounter with the violence that lay beneath the surface of Tudor life, her first test under mortal threat. And she had passed the test, had shown herself steady and brave under pressure, had discovered in herself the nerve to face danger and not be broken by it. That discovery would matter enormously in the years to come, for the courage she found in the Northern Rising would be called upon again in an even more dangerous place when she faced the heresy plot at the court of the king himself. The woman who had kept her head when the rebels held her castle would keep her head again when her enemies sought her life, and the steadiness that first showed itself in the Pilgrimage of Grace would, in the end, help to make her the one who survived. Lord Latimer died in the early months of 1543, his health broken by the strains of those dangerous years, and she was a widow once again, twice wed and twice bereaved, a woman now of about 30, capable and seasoned, and through her marriage to Latimer, reasonably wealthy and well-connected. She came south to the court, where her sister was already established among the Queen's ladies, and she entered the household of the King's elder daughter, the Lady Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, with whom she formed a genuine friendship, with the two women close in their conservative piety and their shared learning. And there, at court in the prime of her life, free at last to choose for herself after 2 arranged marriages, she fell in love truly and deeply, for the first time, with a man named Thomas Seymour. He was the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour, the uncle of the little Prince Edward, a dashing and handsome and charming man, ambitious and bold and attractive, and she, the twice-widowed gentlewoman who had done her duty in 2 arranged marriages, lost her heart to him completely. For the first time in her life she wanted a marriage for herself, for love, and Thomas Seymour courted her, and it seemed that at last, after all her dutiful years, Catherine might have what she truly wished. But it was not to be, or not yet, for a far greater and far more dangerous suitor had also noticed the capable and attractive widow, and when the King of England wanted a woman, no other man could stand in his way. Henry VIII, aging and ailing, and recently rid of his 5th wife, the tragic young Catherine Howard, was looking once more for a queen, and his eye had fallen upon her. He saw in her perhaps exactly what he needed at this stage of his life, not a young girl to inflame his desire as Catherine Howard had done, but a mature, capable, sensible, kind lady who could be a companion to him in his decline, a nurse to his ailing body, a stepmother to his children, a steady and dignified queen. She was perfect for the purpose, and the king determined to have her, and his desire was a command that could not be refused. Imagine her anguish when she understood what was happening, when she realized that the king himself wanted to marry her, just as she had found for the first time a love of her own choosing. To marry Henry was to give up Thomas Seymour, to give up the love she had longed for, to bind herself instead to an aging and deadly tyrant whose wives had met such terrible ends. But to refuse the king was unthinkable, impossible, dangerous in itself. She was trapped, as so many had been trapped between her own heart and Henry's will, and there was only one way the matter could end. She submitted, as she had to, but the submission cost her dearly, and we have her own words to tell us so, for she wrote later, with a frankness that reveals the depth of her struggle, of how she had wished to marry Seymour, but had felt it her duty to follow what she believed was God's will in marrying the king. It had been, she said, a battle between her own will and a higher one, and she had set aside her own desire to do what she believed she must. There is real anguish in those words, the anguish of a woman giving up the joy she had finally found to do her duty to a king she could not refuse, and it tells us much about her character, about the deep faith and the strong sense of duty that governed her, that she could make such a sacrifice and frame it not as a defeat, but as obedience to God. Thomas Seymour, for his part, had no choice but to withdraw, to step aside before the king, for to compete with Henry for a woman was to court destruction. He gave up his suit, removed himself from the situation, and she, setting aside her own heart, prepared to become the sixth wife of Henry VIII. But she did not forget Thomas Seymour, and he did not forget her, and that unfinished love, set aside but not extinguished, would wait in the wings for years, to return at the very end of her story with consequences both joyful and tragic. And so we must pause before the wedding to consider the sheer courage of what she was undertaking, for to marry Henry VIII in the year 1543 was an act that might well have terrified a braver soul. Consider what she knew, what everyone knew about the man she was to marry, and the fate of those who had married him before her. His first wife he had cast aside and left to die in lonely exile. His second he had beheaded. His third had died giving him his son. His fourth he had divorced. His fifth, the young Catherine Howard, he had beheaded only the year before, her death still fresh in every memory. To become the wife of this man was to step into the most perilous position in the kingdom, to follow a procession of women who had been discarded and destroyed, to place oneself in the power of a tyrant whose wrath was death. She knew all this, knew it perfectly well, and yet she went to her wedding with dignity and composure, having made her peace with the sacrifice, having set her own happiness aside, ready to do her duty and to face whatever came. It took a particular kind of courage, quieter than the courage of the battlefield but no less real, to walk willingly into that marriage, and she had it. She would need every bit of it in the years to come. We must look closely at the man Catherine married, at Henry VIII as he was in the year 1543, for she took a king even more ruined and more dangerous than the one Catherine Howard had married 3 years before, and the courage it took to take on such a husband can only be understood when we see him clearly. Cast your mind back, first, to what Henry had once been, for the contrast is the measure of his decline. In his youth he had been a golden prince, the marvel of Europe, tall and athletic and handsome, a sportsman and scholar and musician, charming and magnificent and adored, the very image of a Renaissance king. That had been 30 years and more before she knew him. The man she married bore almost no resemblance to that golden youth, for the decades of power and indulgence and disappointment had transformed him into something close to a monster, in body and in temper, both. By the time she became his wife, Henry was past 50 and grotesquely, enormously fat, his body swollen to a vast and unhealthy bulk, so heavy and so infirm that he could barely move about, requiring mechanical contrivances to be moved up and down stairs, his vast bulk, straining the reinforced furniture made to bear him. He was tormented above all by the ulcer on his leg, a deep and suppurating wound that would not heal, which caused him constant and often agonizing pain, which periodically closed and brought on dangerous fevers, and which by many accounts gave off so foul an odour that it announced his approach. His health was failing in a dozen ways, his vast body breaking down, and the constant pain and the long habit of absolute power had wrought upon his character a terrible transformation, turning the charm of his youth into suspicion, self-pity, and sudden savage cruelty. He was a tyrant now in the fullest sense, capable of destroying anyone who crossed or displeased him, his moods violent and unpredictable, his favour a source of terror because it could turn without warning into lethal wrath. This was the man, aging and gross and ailing and deadly, whom she took as her husband, and the marriage was for her in large part an act of nursing and of careful management, of tending a difficult and frightening invalid while never giving him cause for the suspicion that could destroy her. It was not a marriage in any ordinary sense, not for Catherine, but a perilous duty, and the fact that she took it up willingly and performed it so well for nearly 4 years until his death is itself a measure of her exceptional capability and nerve. We shall see in a moment exactly what that duty demanded of her day by day. For the present, it is enough to say that she was, in effect, nursing an ogre, and doing it under the constant threat of destruction, and that she did it superbly, with a patience and a steadiness that few in her place could have matched. And we should pause to appreciate the particular courage of taking on such a marriage at all, knowing what she knew. She was not a naive girl, swept up by forces she did not understand, as Catherine Howard had been. She was a mature, intelligent, experienced woman who understood perfectly well what she was undertaking and what the dangers were. She knew the history of Henry's wives, the divorces and the beheadings, the long procession of women destroyed. She knew the man's character, his cruelty and his suspicion, and his lethal temper. She knew that to be his wife was to step into the most dangerous position in the kingdom, to place herself in the power of a tyrant who had killed before and would kill again. And she also knew painfully that in accepting him, she was giving up the love she had found with Thomas Seymour, sacrificing her own happiness for this perilous duty. She went into the marriage with her eyes fully open, understanding everything, dreading much, and she went through with it anyway with dignity and composure, because the king commanded it, and because she believed it her duty. That clear-eyed courage, that willingness to take up a fearful burden knowingly and bear it well, is one of the most admirable things about her, and it stands in moving contrast to the helpless bewilderment of the young girl who had been queen before her. Henry and his new queen were married on the 12th of July, 1543, in a quiet ceremony at Hampton Court, and so Catherine Parr became the 6th Queen of Henry VIII, and took up the strange and perilous duties of a position that had destroyed so many before her. The marriage was, from the start, a different kind of thing from the king's earlier unions, for there was no question here of youthful passion or dynastic desperation. Henry did not need an heir, for he had his son Edward at last. He was not inflamed with desire as he had been for Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard. What he wanted now, in the last years of his life, was comfort and companionship, a capable and dignified wife to ease his decline, and that was what she gave him. There was no romance in this union, no passion on either side that we can see, but rather a kind of contract of mutual need, the old king seeking ease, and the gentlewoman accepting the perilous honour he pressed upon her. What that acceptance would require of her, the daily labour and the daily peril of it, we shall come to shortly. For the moment it is enough to say that she entered the marriage clear-eyed, knowing what she took on, and that she brought to it the same steady competence she had brought to everything else in her well-tried life. Let's consider more closely the daily reality of her marriage to Henry, the actual texture of her life as the wife and nurse of the aging king, for it was a strange and demanding existence, and the way she conducted it reveals much about her character and her remarkable patience. We have spoken of Henry as a wreck of a man in these years, gross and ailing and dangerous, and we have spoken of Catherine as his nurse as much as his wife, but it is worth dwelling on what that actually meant, day by day, for the woman who lived it. To be married to Henry in his decline was to be bound to a suffering, irritable, frightening invalid whose body was failing and whose temper was savage, and to make it one's daily work to ease his pain and humour his moods and care for his failing person, all while never forgetting the menace that lurked beneath his favour. Consider the king's physical state, and what it demanded of the wife who tended him. His ulcerated leg caused him constant pain, and when it flared, agony, putting him in the foulest of tempers, making him dangerous to all around him. His vast bulk made him nearly immobile, dependent on others to move him, a vast suffering mass of a man who could do little for himself. His health failed in a dozen ways, his body breaking down, his sufferings many and various, and Catherine, as his wife, made it her business to tend all this, to soothe his pain, to comfort his sufferings, to bring to the difficult work of nursing him a patience and a skill and a genuine kindness. She had nursed a dying husband before, in Lord Latimer, and she brought to the nursing of Henry the same competent compassion, easing his pain, tending his body, comforting his decline, doing the hard and often unpleasant work of caring for a failing and difficult old man. But it was not only the physical nursing that demanded her care, for Henry's temper was as dangerous as his body was failing, and she had to manage his moods as carefully as she tended his wounds, knowing that his displeasure could destroy her. This was perhaps the harder task, the constant management of a volatile and unpredictable man, the perpetual care never to give offence, never to arouse the suspicion or the anger that could prove fatal. She had to humour him, flatter him, soothe his irritations, navigate his moods, always alert to the danger, always careful, always managing. It was exhausting work. Surely this unceasing emotional labour, this perpetual vigilance, and the heresy plot showed just how real the danger was, how a single misstep, a single excess of boldness, could bring the whole machinery of destruction down upon her. To be Henry's wife was to be perpetually on duty, perpetually careful, perpetually managing a dangerous man, and she did it day after day for nearly 4 years with a skill and a steadiness that few could have matched. That she did it so well, that she survived it, and even, by general account, performed the role of queen with such dignity and success, is a testament to her extraordinary character, to the patience and the skill and the nerve that she brought to an almost impossible task. Another woman might have broken under the strain, might have given offence and been destroyed, might have failed in the difficult work of nursing and managing the perilous king. Catherine did not break, did not fail, but performed her perilous duty with a competence and a grace that won Henry's trust and affection, and carried her safely through to his death. She was, in the truest sense, equal to her task, however hard and dangerous that task was, bringing to it all the gifts of patience and intelligence and nerve that her exceptional character could supply. The woman who nursed the dying ogre and managed his lethal temper and survived to bury him was a woman of rare and admirable strength, and the daily reality of her marriage, demanding and dangerous as it was, reveals that strength more clearly perhaps than any of her more dramatic achievements. She did the hard, quiet work of survival day after day, and she did it superbly. But she was far more than a nurse, and her queenship was far more than mere attendance on a dying king, for she brought to the role a dignity and a capability and a warmth that made her, by general agreement, an excellent queen, perhaps the most successful of all the 6 in the actual performance of the office. She presided over the court with grace, maintained a household of learning and piety and culture, surrounded herself with learned women, and engaged in the religious and intellectual questions of the day. She was generous and kind, winning genuine affection from those around her, and she conducted herself with a dignity that never faltered. And above all, she achieved something that none of the king's other wives had managed, something that would be one of her most lasting achievements, for she set herself to heal the broken family of Henry VIII, to draw together the king's 3 scattered and damaged offspring, and to be a true mother to them, and in this she succeeded beautifully. To feel the full weight of what she endured and achieved, It helps to understand the peculiar danger of the world she moved in, the deadly nature of life close to the throne in the England of Henry VIII, for it was an age in which proximity to power was proximity to death, and survival required gifts that few possessed. The court of Henry VIII was the centre of all power and wealth and advancement in the kingdom, the place where fortunes were made, where the highest prizes of the realm were won, where ambitious men and women gathered to seek the favour that could raise them to the heights. But it was also the most perilous place in England, for the same favour that could raise a person could destroy them, and the king at the centre of it all was a man of lethal and unpredictable temper, whose displeasure was death. To be close to Henry was to live always in peril, to walk perpetually on the edge of a precipice, for the higher one rose in his favour, the further one had to fall, and no one rose higher or stood more precariously than those closest to the king. The history of Henry's reign is littered with the wreckage of those who rose high and then fell, who enjoyed royal favour and then felt his wrath, who were raised to the heights and then cast down to destruction. His chief ministers, the men who served him most ably and most faithfully, were destroyed one after another when they ceased to please him, or when their enemies prevailed against them. Wolsey broken, More beheaded, Cromwell sent to the block. His wives, as we have seen, were divorced and beheaded and discarded. His friends and favourites and servants, the leading men of his court, lived always under the shadow of his temper, knowing that the favour they enjoyed today might turn to wrath tomorrow, that a single misstep or a single enemy's whisper could bring them down. It was a realm of perpetual peril, of constant watchfulness and unceasing intrigue, where the factions schemed endlessly against one another, and where the price of losing was so often death. To survive in such a world, to thrive in it, to rise and not fall, required extraordinary skill and nerve and judgment, a constant alertness to threat, a perpetual care in word and deed. And the women who married Henry faced this peril in its most acute form, for they were bound to him most closely of all, and their fates depended most directly on his shifting favour and his lethal temper. A minister might be dismissed, a courtier might retire from the dangerous game, but a wife was bound to the king, could not escape him, lived in the most intimate proximity to his menace. The queens of Henry VIII held the highest position a woman could hold and the most perilous, for they were closest of all to the king's power and Henry's wrath, and their history, the divorces and the beheadings, shows how deadly that closeness could be. To be Henry's wife was to live at the very heart of the danger, bound to a man who had destroyed wives before, dependent on his favour for one's very life, and the women who held that position needed, if they were to survive it, each gift of nerve and skill and judgment that a human being could possess. Catherine Parr possessed those gifts, and that is why she survived where others were destroyed, for she brought to the deadly game of the Tudor court exactly the qualities it demanded: the intelligence, the nerve, the judgment, the constant careful watchfulness, the ability to manage a volatile man and to save herself in a crisis. She understood the peril she was in, never underestimated it, never grew careless or complacent. She managed the king with skill, tended his moods, avoided giving offence, navigated the perils of her position with a constant care. And when the crisis came, when her enemies moved against her and her life hung in the balance, she found the wit and the nerve to save herself, to turn aside her destruction through sheer cleverness. She was, in short, a master of the deadly game, equipped as few were to survive the perils of life close to Henry's throne, and her survival was no accident of fortune, but the achievement of her own remarkable gifts. In an age that destroyed so many, she lived, and she lived because she was clever enough, and brave enough, and careful enough to do what survival in that world required. The survivor survived because she had earned the right to, by the exercise of gifts that few possessed and that she possessed in full measure. Let me show you the court over which she presided as queen, the texture of her daily life in those years, for she made of the queen's household something distinctive and fine, a household of learning and piety and culture that reflected her own remarkable character. The court of Henry VIII was, as we have seen on other evenings, a place of overwhelming magnificence and deadly danger, both, the centre of all power and wealth and fashion in the kingdom, a glittering and perilous world. But within that glittering court, the Queen kept her own establishment, her own circle of ladies and servants and attendants, her own apartments and her own daily life, and a queen could shape that circle after her own character, or could make of it what she would. She made of hers a place quite unlike those of the young and frivolous queens who had gone before, a centre of intellectual seriousness and religious devotion and genuine culture, gathering around herself women of learning and piety, scholars and reformers, creating a small world that reflected her own deepest interests and values. Picture the Queen's apartments in those years, and the life that went on within them. There would be the reading and discussion of works of devotion, for she made her chambers a centre of the reformed study that was her passion, gathering her ladies to read the scripture together, to discuss the deepest questions of faith, to engage with the new ideas of faith that were transforming the age. There would be learning and scholarship, the Queen herself at her studies, her books about her, learned men and women coming and going, the intellectual life of the realm finding a home in the Queen's rooms. There would be the business of patronage, for she used her position to support scholars and writers and the causes she believed in, her household a home of cultural and religious patronage. And there would be, too, the ordinary magnificence of a queen's life, the fine clothes and the jewels and the music, for Catherine, though serious and devout, was no joyless Puritan, but one who enjoyed beauty and elegance, who dressed magnificently and loved fine things, combining her intellectual and religious seriousness with a genuine appreciation of the magnificence proper to a queen. The tone of the household she kept was unlike anything the court had seen under the young and pleasure-loving queens who came before, where the rooms had rung with music and dancing, and the lighter amusements of a youthful court. Hers were given over to study and conversation, to the reading aloud of serious books, to talk of weighty matters among women who had been taught to think. There was music still and beauty, and the proper magnificence of a queen's chambers, for Catherine was no enemy of elegance, but threaded through it all was a seriousness of purpose, a sense that the queen's apartments were a place where the mind was meant to be fed as well as the eye delighted. To step into her rooms was to enter an atmosphere of quiet industry and high talk, a little academy presided over by a learned and gracious queen, and those who passed through it carried away, many of them, a lasting impression of what a court might be when a woman of substance set its tone. And over this whole household, this little world of learning and faith and culture, she presided with a grace and a dignity and a warmth that won her the genuine affection of those around her, and made her, by general agreement, one of the most admirable queens of the age. She was a kind mistress, generous and considerate to those who served her, inspiring real loyalty and love. She was a dignified queen, conducting herself with a poise that never faltered even in the most dangerous moments. She was a serious and cultured woman, making her court a place of real intellectual and spiritual worth. And she was, through it all, a warm and human presence, capable of friendship and affection and joy, not a cold or remote figure, but a woman whom people genuinely loved. The Queen's household under Catherine Parr was a reflection of the woman herself, learned and pious and dignified and warm, and it stood as a kind of rebuke to the frivolity and danger of so much of the court around it, an island of seriousness and worth in the glittering, perilous sea of Henry's court. It was perhaps the truest expression of who Catherine was, and it remains one of the finest things about her. It is worth pausing to picture the England that she moved through as queen, the England of the 1540s, for it was a country in the midst of profound change, and she lived at the very centre of its transformation. The England of her queenship was a realm being remade, its ancient religious life torn up by the Reformation, its ancient monasteries dissolved and their lands redistributed, its old certainties giving way to new ideas and new arrangements. It was a country still largely rural, its people mostly living on the land, in villages and small towns, working the fields and tending the flocks as their forebears had done for centuries. But it was also a country where new forces were stirring, where trade was growing, where a new class of educated and ambitious people was rising, where the printing press was spreading ideas and the new learning was transforming minds. It was an age of change and ferment, of danger and opportunity, and she, the educated gentlewoman who became queen, was in many ways its representative figure, a woman of the new learning and the new faith at the very summit of the changing realm. The court over which she presided was the glittering centre of this kingdom, the place where its wealth and power and culture were concentrated, and it was a scene of extraordinary magnificence. The royal palaces, Hampton Court and Greenwich and Whitehall and the rest, were among the grandest buildings in the land, hung with rich tapestries, furnished with every luxury, filled with the treasures of the crown. The court was a place of constant ceremony and display, of feasts and entertainments, and the elaborate rituals of royal life, where the highest of the realm gathered in their finery to bask in the warmth of royal favour, and the Queen was at the centre of much of this magnificence, presiding over her household, appearing in the high ceremonies of the court, clothed in the rich garments and the magnificent jewels that her position demanded. She, for all her seriousness and her piety, was no enemy of this splendour, but a full participant in it, dressing magnificently, loving fine things, presiding over her court with a dignity and a grace that befitted the magnificence of her position. Yet beneath the glittering surface, the court was also, as we have seen, a place of deadly danger and constant intrigue, and she had to navigate both aspects of it, the magnificence and the menace, with equal skill. She had to play her part in the splendour, presiding over the ceremonies and the entertainments, maintaining the dignity and display proper to a queen, and she had to navigate the menace, the factional intrigues and the deadly games of power, the perpetual threat that lurked beneath the glittering surface, the constant possibility of destruction. It was a setting that demanded a kind of double vision, an appreciation of its splendour and an alertness to its perils, an ability to enjoy the magnificence while never forgetting the menace, and she possessed exactly this double capability, this ability to shine in the grandeur and survive the danger, to be both a magnificent queen and a careful survivor. She moved through the glittering, perilous life of the court with a grace and a wariness combined, at home in its magnificence and alert to its perils, and that combination was one of the secrets of her success. There is a particular poignancy in placing Catherine in this setting, this glittering, dangerous, changing England of the 1540s, for she was so much a part of it, and yet, in the end, she escaped it, leaving the wide world behind for the peace of the Gloucestershire countryside and her brief domestic happiness before her death. She had moved through the centre of power, presided over the magnificent court, navigated the deadly dangers, governed the kingdom, touched the major events and the bitter struggles of her age. And then when the king died and she was free, she withdrew from all of it, from the magnificence and the menace alike, retiring to her country home, to her marriage and her coming child, seeking at the last, not the dazzling life of the court, but the still round of domestic happiness. There is something fitting in that withdrawal, that the woman who had given so much to the world should claim, at the last, a quiet joy of her own, away from the grandeur and the danger, in the green peace of the countryside. That she found there not only happiness, but death does not cancel the rightness of the withdrawal, the seeking, after all the years at the centre, of a gentler and more human joy. The queen who had shone in the glittering court died in the quiet countryside, and there is a kind of rightness in that ending, everything left behind at the last for the small and human and still. Consider the state of that family when she came to it, for it was a wreckage of broken relationships and damaged children. There was Mary, the eldest, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, now a woman in her late 20s, who had been declared a bastard, separated from her mother, bullied and humiliated through the long years of her father's other marriages, her health and her spirits broken by it all. There was Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, a clever, watchful child of about 10, whose mother had been beheaded, who had been declared a bastard in her turn, who had grown up in the strange, shadowed position of a disgraced princess. And there was Edward, the longed-for son, Jane Seymour's boy, a small and precious child of about 6, motherless, kept apart, the heir on whom everything depended. 3 of them, of 3 different mothers, 2 of them declared illegitimate, all of them marked in different ways by the chaos and cruelty of their father's marital career, scattered and separated and starved of maternal love, and she gathered them in. She brought them to court, drew them together, treated all 3 with warmth and care, became a genuine and loving stepmother to each, and created, for the first time in their broken lives, something like a real family. What she did for these 3 was, at heart, a work of healing, the patient mending of a family that her husband's marriages had torn apart. She did not merely tolerate her stepchildren, as a queen might have done from duty, nor confine herself to seeing them clothed and lodged and taught. She drew them together, made them feel themselves a family again, gave them a household in which they were welcome and valued and loved. She brought them to court, kept them near her where she could, smoothed the old jealousies and griefs that divided them, and created, out of the wreckage their father had made, something warm and lasting. For young people who had known rejection and loss and the cold uncertainty of disgrace, this restoration of family feeling was a gift beyond price, and it is among the kindest and most quietly important of all the things she did. We shall see, when we come to the young Elizabeth in particular, how far that influence reached. But it began here, in the simple human work of gathering the broken into the warmth of a real home. Of the 3 royal children whom she gathered into her care, the eldest, Mary, had suffered the longest and the most, and her kindness to her healed wounds that had been festering for many bitter years. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, the Spanish princess whom the king had cast aside, and her childhood and youth had been destroyed by the catastrophe of her parents' marriage. She had been born a princess, the cherished only child of a royal marriage raised in every expectation of a glorious future, beloved and honoured. And then her world had collapsed, and when her father determined to discard her mother and marry Anne Boleyn. Mary had been declared illegitimate, a bastard, her parents' marriage annulled, her own status destroyed. She had been separated from her beloved mother, forbidden to see her even as Catherine of Aragon lay dying. She had been bullied and pressured and humiliated, made to serve in the household of her infant half-sister Elizabeth, forced eventually to sign a document acknowledging her own illegitimacy and her mother's disgrace, a submission wrung from her that broke something in her spirit. By the time Catherine Parr came into her life, Mary was a woman in her late 20s, her health damaged, her spirit scarred, her years of suffering written deep in her character. Catherine Parr was close to Mary in age, only a few years older, and the two women had much in common, for both were serious and pious and learned, though they would come to differ on the deepest questions of faith, Mary remaining staunchly Catholic where she embraced reform. Despite this difference, or perhaps transcending it, the two formed a genuine friendship, a true bond of affection and respect, and her kindness and companionship meant a vast deal to the lonely and damaged Mary. Catherine treated her stepdaughter, who was almost her contemporary, with warmth and consideration, drew her to court, restored her to a place of honour and dignity, gave her the companionship and the family feeling that had been so cruelly absent from her life for so long. For Mary, who had known so much rejection and humiliation, the kindness of her father's new wife must have been a balm, a restoration of something she had lost, and the friendship between the two women was real and valuable to both. Her influence extended too to the weighty matter of Mary's place in the succession, for one of Catherine's most important achievements as Queen was her part in restoring both Mary and Elizabeth to their place in the line of succession to the throne. Both girls had been declared illegitimate, removed from the succession, their right to inherit destroyed by their parents' disgrace. But Catherine, who had healed the family and drawn the children together, used her influence with the king to help bring about their restoration, and in the last years of Henry's reign, both Mary and Elizabeth were returned to the succession, placed after their brother Edward, in the line to inherit the throne. This was a matter of enormous consequence, for it meant that when Edward died young and childless, the throne passed first to Mary and then to Elizabeth, exactly as the restored succession provided. Without that restoration, the history of England might have been very different, and Parr had a genuine hand in bringing it about, helping to secure the thrones that Mary and then Elizabeth would one day occupy. It was one of her quieter but more consequential achievements, her part in restoring the king's daughters to their inheritance. There is a poignancy in the relationship between Catherine and Mary, given what came after, for the two friends would be divided by religion in the years that followed, and Mary would become, after her death, a very different kind of figure from the gentle reforming queen who had befriended her. Mary's own reign, when it came, would be marked by her determined effort to restore the Catholic faith and to undo the Reformation that she had served, and by the burning of Protestants that earned her a grim and lasting name. The friendship between the reforming Catherine and the Catholic Mary, real and warm as it was in her queenship, contained within it the seeds of the deep division over faith that would tear England apart for generations, the two women standing, for all their personal affection, on opposite sides of the deepest question of their age. But in the years of her queenship, that division lay in the future, and what was true and present was the kindness of a stepmother to a damaged and lonely woman, the healing of old wounds, the restoration of a measure of dignity and family feeling to a princess who had suffered too much. Whatever came later, she was good to Mary when Mary needed kindness, and that should be remembered to her credit. But it is in her influence upon the second of the royal children, the young Elizabeth, that Parr's hand reached furthest into the future, for the stepmother helped shape the woman who would become the greatest of all English monarchs, and the debt that Elizabeth and England owed to Catherine is incalculable. When she became queen, Elizabeth was a girl of about 10, clever, watchful, self-possessed, whose own history was already marked by tragedy and disgrace. Her mother was Anne Boleyn, beheaded when Elizabeth was not yet 3, and she had grown up in the strange shadowed condition of a king's daughter who had been declared a bastard, removed from the succession, her mother a name not to be spoken, her own status uncertain and diminished. She was intelligent beyond her years, precociously clever, but she had grown up without a mother's love, in a kind of internal exile, a princess who was not quite a princess, but watchful and guarded as a young person must be, who has grasped early how dangerous the world can be. She drew this clever, wary girl into the warmth of a real family, and more than that, she took a profound interest in Elizabeth's learning, fostering and directing the training of the girl's remarkable mind. She, the scholar queen, the believer in learning for women, recognized in Elizabeth a kindred intelligence, a mind of extraordinary capacity, and she set herself to see that intellect properly cultivated. She brought in the finest tutors, the great humanist scholars of the age, to educate Elizabeth in languages and letters and the classical learning that was the height of Renaissance schooling. She encouraged the girl's studies, took an interest in her progress, set before her the example of a learned and capable woman who read and wrote and thought, and even governed. Under her influence and direction, Elizabeth received a training as fine as any prince of Europe, mastering languages, steeping herself in the classics, developing the powerful and cultivated intellect that would one day make her so formidable a ruler. The young Elizabeth flourished in this atmosphere of learning and encouragement, blossoming under the care of a stepmother who valued exactly the gifts that she possessed in such abundance. The example that she set before Elizabeth may have mattered as much as the formal education she provided, for in Catherine the watchful girl saw, daily, what a person of intelligence and strength and faith could be and could achieve. She saw someone learned, who read and wrote and engaged with the deepest ideas of the age, proving that a woman's mind was capable of the highest cultivation. She saw someone capable, who managed a large household and even governed a realm, proving that her sex could wield power with skill. She saw nerve and courage, a stepmother who faced down deadly threat with wit and steadiness, proving that a woman could be brave and clever in the face of mortal danger. And she saw dignity and grace and faith held with poise through each trial, for one who would herself one day need all of these qualities, who would one day govern England as a woman alone in a world of powerful men. The example of Catherine Parr must have been formative beyond measure, a living demonstration of what a strong and clever woman could be and do. It is one of the quiet influences of history, this shaping of Elizabeth by Catherine, and it is too little remembered, for when we think of the making of that great queen, we think of her own genius, her own remarkable character, and rightly so. But that genius was nurtured and that character was partly formed in the years she spent in the household of Catherine Parr, under the wing of a stepmother who loved her, educated her, and showed her by her own example what a woman might be. The learning that Elizabeth would deploy so brilliantly as queen, the courage she would show in danger, the skill with which she would govern, the dignity with which she would hold herself, all of these were qualities that she possessed and that she fostered in the young girl in her care. When we marvel at Elizabeth, we should remember Catherine, the stepmother who helped to make her, whose hand reached through the girl into the reign that followed, shaping the destiny of England through the child she loved and taught. It may be the greatest of all Catherine's many achievements, this part in the making of Elizabeth, and it alone would secure her a place among the most consequential women of her age. The third of Catherine's stepchildren, the young Edward, was in some ways the most important of the three, for he was the heir, the longed-for son on whom the whole future of the dynasty depended, and her care for him touched the future of the kingdom. Edward was a small boy when she became queen, about 6 years old, the son of Jane Seymour, who had died giving him birth, so that he too, like his half-sisters, was a boy without a mother. He was a precious and a carefully guarded child, the only legitimate son, the heir to the throne, raised with every care and precaution, surrounded by physicians and attendants, anxious to protect the life on which the dynasty's hopes rested. He was an intelligent and serious boy, precociously clever like his half-sister Elizabeth, and he was being raised and educated to be a king, given the finest education, trained for the high destiny that awaited him. She became a loving stepmother to this small, motherless boy, drawing him into the family she was building, showing him the warmth that a motherless child needed, and taking, as with the others, a particular interest in his education. Edward was being raised in the Reformed religion, more thoroughly Protestant than his father, and her own reforming sympathies aligned with the direction of his upbringing so that she could encourage and support the formation in faith of the boy who would one day be the Protestant King of England. She fostered his education, encouraged his studies, gave him the family feeling and the maternal care that his own mother's death had denied him. The relationship between Catherine and the young Edward was warm and genuine, the boy fond of his kind stepmother, Catherine devoted to the precious boy, and for a few years Edward knew through Catherine something of the family warmth that his position and his motherlessness might otherwise have denied him entirely. The poignancy of Edward's story, like that of his sisters, lies partly in what came after, in the brief and troubled reign that awaited him, for the longed-for heir would not live to fulfill the high hopes invested in him. When Henry died, the young Edward became king, a boy of 9, and his reign, conducted in his name by the leading men who governed during his minority, saw the further advance of the Protestant Reformation that she had served. But Edward was a sickly boy, and his reign was brief, for he died young, in his teens, before he could come fully into his own, but before he could marry or beget an heir or rule in his own right. His early death created the succession crisis that brought first Mary and then Elizabeth to the throne, the daughters whom she had helped to restore to the succession, inheriting the crown that their brother left empty. The boy whom she had mothered, the heir on whom everything depended, proved a frail vessel for so much hope, and his early death reshaped the whole future of the kingdom, opening the way for the reigns of his sisters, and ultimately for the golden age of Elizabeth. There is something moving in the thought of Catherine with these 3 young people, the damaged Mary, the clever Elizabeth, the precious Edward, gathering them into the warmth of a real family, mothering the motherless, healing the wounds that their fathers' marriages had inflicted, and shaping, through her care and her influence, the 3 who would in turn rule England. For all 3 of Henry's children would sit upon the throne one after another, Edward and then Mary and then Elizabeth, and all 3 had passed, in their formative years, through the loving hands of Catherine Parr, the stepmother who had drawn them together and given them for a few years the family they had lacked. It is a remarkable thing to consider that the woman who was his last wife was stepmother to 3 successive monarchs of England, that her care and her influence touched all 3 reigns that followed Henry's own. Whatever else she achieved, and she achieved much, that this alone would make her a figure of real consequence. The stepmother of 3 sovereigns, the queen who mothered the future of the kingdom in the persons of the 3 royal children she gathered into her care and her love. Now we come to what is, perhaps, the most remarkable fact about Catherine Parr, the thing that sets her apart from every other wife of Henry VIII, and indeed from almost everyone of her age, for she was a scholar and a writer, a person of genuine learning and intellectual courage, who became the first of her sex in the history of England to publish a book in the English language under her own name. Think for a moment about how extraordinary that is. In an age when women were not supposed to have public voices at all, when learning in one of them was regarded with suspicion, and any who presumed to write and publish was doing something almost unheard of, she, the Queen, set her own name to her books and gave them to the world. That single fact places her in a category entirely her own among the 6, and indeed among the women of her century, for whatever the others were or did, none of them stepped out so boldly into the public life of the mind. None claimed so plainly the right to be heard. We shall come in a moment to the books themselves and to what they reveal of her, but pause first on the sheer daring of the act, the Queen of England setting her hand to her own written thoughts and offering them to a world that held a woman had no business with such things. We have spoken of Catherine as the first woman in England to publish a book under her own name, and this achievement is so remarkable and so central to who she was that it deserves a fuller telling, for in her writing we find the truest expression of her mind and her soul. Her first published work was a book of prayers and meditations, devotional writing gathered and composed for the spiritual benefit of its readers. It was the kind of book that fitted comfortably within what was thought acceptable for a pious woman, a collection of prayers, and it was published while Henry was still alive, appearing under the Queen's name and finding a wide and appreciative readership. It was beautiful and serious devotional writing, and its success established Catherine as a religious author of true standing, but it was, in a sense, a safe book, a work of conventional piety that gave little offence and revealed only a part of the woman who wrote it. Her second book was a far more remarkable and a far more daring work, a deeply personal account of her own spiritual journey, her own wrestling with sin and faith and grace, published after Henry's death when she was free to express her reformed convictions more openly. In this book she wrote with extraordinary frankness about her own inner life, her sense of her own sinfulness, her experience of God's grace, her journey from a more conventional faith to the evangelical convictions she had come to hold. It was confessional writing of rare power and beauty, intensely personal, theologically serious, revealing a mind and a soul of unusual depth and a writer of true gift. And it was in its open embrace of the Reformed faith a brave and significant work, a public declaration of evangelical belief by the Dowager Queen of England, a contribution to the devotional literature and the struggle over faith of the age. This book, more than the first, reveals the true Catherine, the serious thinker, the convinced reformer, the woman of deep inner life and genuine literary talent, and it secures her place as a writer of genuine importance, not merely a royal author, but a true voice in the religious literature of her time. The significance of her authorship goes beyond the quality of the books themselves, remarkable as that is, for in publishing under her own name she did something that no Englishwoman had done before, claiming a public voice in an age that denied women any voice at all. Consider what it meant. In a world where women were supposed to be silent, subordinate, confined to the private sphere, where a woman who presumed to write and publish and instruct was doing something almost transgressive, she, the Queen, put her name to her books and gave them to the world, spoke publicly on the deepest questions of faith, claimed her place in the intellectual and religious life of her age. It was an act of real boldness, a quiet revolution, the assertion that a woman might have words worth publishing, that a woman's mind and soul might be worth the world's attention, and in doing it as Queen, at the very summit of society, she made it a little more possible for other women to follow, opened a door that had been firmly closed, established by her own example that a woman could be an author. It was a pioneering act, and it makes Catherine a figure of real importance in the history, not only of her own age, but of women's writing, the first of a long line, the one who went first through the door. There is a deep fitness in the fact that she, of all the 6 wives, should be the one remembered as a writer, for it captures exactly what set her apart, her mind, her learning, her inner life, the qualities that made her so much more than merely a king's wife. The other wives are remembered for their relationships to Henry, for how they came to him and how they left him, defined by the king they married. Catherine alone is remembered for something that was entirely her own, that had nothing to do with Henry, that she made and did herself, her books, the products of her own mind and soul. In her writing, she stepped out from the shadow of the king and stood as a person in her own right, a thinker, a writer, a woman with her own voice and her own contribution to make to the world, and that, perhaps, is the truest measure of her distinction among the six, that she alone left behind a body of work made by her own hand and mind, a body of work that we can still read, through which we can still hear her own voice speaking across the centuries, the voice of a serious and gifted and courageous woman who had something to say and said it, the first of the English women to do so under her own name. Her writing flowed from the centre of who she was, from her profound and serious religious faith, and here we touch upon the central passion and the gravest danger of her life. For her devotion was not the safe and conventional piety expected of a queen, but a faith far more particular and far more perilous, a conviction that drew her toward the very ideas the king most feared, and that would, before long, bring her closer to the fire than any of her other troubles ever did. We shall come shortly to the great religious struggle of her age, and to the part she played in it, for it is a story that deserves to be told in full. But it begins here, in the simple and dangerous fact that the Queen of England believed in her heart things that her husband might have sent her to the stake for holding. Her life was bound up, from first to last, with the vast transformation of faith of her age, and it is worth standing back to consider what that transformation was and what her part in it meant, for she was not merely a bystander to the English Reformation, but an active and a significant participant in it. The Reformation was the defining event of the 16th century, the splitting of Western Christianity, the revolution in religion that reshaped the spiritual and political life of all Europe. It had begun on the continent, with the protests of reformers against the abuses and the doctrines of the old church, and it had spread across Europe like fire, dividing nations, sparking wars, transforming the way millions of people understood their faith and their salvation. In England, the Reformation had taken a peculiar course, beginning with Henry's break from Rome for his own dynastic reasons, but opening the door to the deeper religious changes that the reformers sought, the embrace of the new Protestant theology, the translation of the scripture into English, the transformation of the English church. She stood firmly on the reforming side of this fierce struggle, and as queen she lent her influence and her position to the advancement of the reformed cause at a crucial and dangerous moment. The last years of Henry's reign were a time of uncertainty and struggle, for the king himself remained conservative in religion even after his break with Rome, and the coming direction of the English church hung in the balance, contested between the conservatives, who wished to halt the Reformation, and the reformers who wished to push it forward. The crucial question was what would happen when Henry died, what direction of faith the kingdom would take under his successor, and this was a question that the factions fought over with deadly intensity, for whoever controlled the coming reign would control the religious future of England. Catherine, with her reforming sympathies, her influence over the king's children, her hand in their education and their formation in faith, was an important figure in this struggle, working to ensure that the future would belong to the reformed faith she believed in. And the years to come did belong, in large part, to the cause Catherine served, for after Henry's death the Reformation advanced rapidly under his son Edward, the boy whom she had helped to raise in the reformed faith. Under Edward, England became, for the first time, a genuinely Protestant kingdom. The Reformation pushed forward, the old faith further dismantled, the new theology established. There would be a violent reversal under Mary, who tried to restore the Catholic faith and burned Protestants in the attempt. But then, under Elizabeth, the Reformation would be established for good, England settling at last into the Protestant identity that would shape its history for centuries to come. And both of these reigns, Edward's and Elizabeth's, were the reigns of those whom she had mothered and helped to form, raised under her influence, shaped by the reforming convictions she had fostered in them. The religious future of England, in other words, was shaped in part by Catherine Parr, through her sway over the children who would rule, through her hand in their education and their faith, through the reformed convictions she planted in the young Edward and the young Elizabeth. It is a striking legacy when you consider it fully, for it means that Parr, the sixth wife, the survivor, had a genuine and lasting hand in shaping the religious destiny of her country. She did not do it through dramatic public acts, for that was not open to a woman of her age, but through the quieter channels available to her, through her hold over the king's children, through her own writing and example, through the reforming faith she fostered in the future rulers of England. The cause she served, the Reformation she believed in, would triumph in the end, would shape England for centuries, and she had played her part in that triumph, a part too little remembered, but genuine and significant. She was not merely a wife who survived, but a participant in the great transformation of faith of her age, a woman who used her position and her influence to advance the cause she believed in, and who saw that cause, through the children she had helped to raise, carried forward and established at last. Her faith was the centre of her life, and through her faith she touched the future of her nation. One more way in which this exceptional woman was so much more than merely the one who survived. To understand the peril that she courted and the cause she served, we must understand the great upheaval of faith of her age, for she lived at the very heart of the storm that was the English Reformation, and her own faith placed her on the most dangerous side of it. The England of her life was a kingdom torn apart by religion, still reeling from the revolution that Henry had begun when he broke with the Church of Rome. That break had been for Henry a matter of politics and desire, his means to discard his first wife and marry Anne Boleyn, and the king himself remained, in his beliefs, largely a traditional Catholic, rejecting only the authority of the Pope. But the break with Rome had unleashed forces far beyond the king's control, for it opened England to the new ideas of faith pouring out of Europe, the Protestant Reformation that was transforming the continent, the radical new theology that challenged the very foundations of the old faith. And so England in Catherine's day was a kingdom in religious turmoil, suspended between the old Catholic world and the new Protestant one, its people and its leaders divided, often violently, over the deepest questions of faith and salvation. This division over faith ran through the very heart of the court and the government, and it was no mere matter of private conscience, but a deadly political struggle for the two great factions, the conservatives who wished to preserve as much of the old faith as possible, and the reformers who wished to push toward the new Protestant ideas, were locked in a battle for control of the king and the kingdom, and the stakes were life and death. Each side sought to win royal favour, to control the direction of policy of faith, to destroy its rivals, and the weapons of this struggle were terrible, accusations of heresy or treason that could lead to the stake or the block. In the last years of Henry's reign, this struggle reached a particular intensity, for everyone could see that the king was failing, that he would soon die and leave a child to succeed him, and whichever faction controlled the court at that crucial moment would control the future. It was into this deadly struggle, this high-stakes battle for the religious soul of England, that she threw herself, and she threw herself dangerously onto the reforming side, for she was no lukewarm conformist, but a person of deep and serious and increasingly radical religious conviction, drawn powerfully toward the Reformed faith, the evangelical ideas that emphasized personal faith and the authority of Scripture and salvation by grace. Her religion was the center of her life, the wellspring of her writing and her thought, and she pursued it with a passionate seriousness. She read the Scripture and the Reformed religious works. She gathered around her a circle of like-minded believers. She made her household a hub of reformed study and discussion, and she used her position and her influence to advance the cause she believed in. This was a brave and a perilous thing to do, for the reformed ideas she embraced went well beyond what the conservative king would tolerate, strayed into territory that could be called heresy, and in pursuing them so openly, she was taking a real and mortal risk. She was the queen, which gave her some protection, but the queen was not beyond the reach of a charge of heresy, as she would very nearly discover, and in making herself the leader of the reforming party at court, she became the chief target of the conservatives who wished to destroy that party. The circle of women that she gathered around her was an extraordinary and a dangerous thing, a community of shared faith and learning at the heart of the court, and it deserves to be remembered, for it was something genuinely new and genuinely brave. These were educated, serious, convinced women, drawn together by their shared faith and their love of learning, meeting to study the scripture and discuss the reformed ideas, supporting one another in their dangerous convictions. They were, in a sense, a community of dissent, gathered around the queen, pursuing at the very centre of power a faith that the king would have regarded with deep suspicion, and their existence was a measure of Catherine's courage and her conviction that she would gather and lead such a circle in such a place at such a time. It was also, of course, the source of her greatest danger, for this circle of reforming women was exactly what alarmed and angered the conservative faction, exactly the threat they sought to eliminate. And when they moved against Catherine, it was her religion and her circle that they used as their weapon. The community of faith that was Catherine's finest creation and deepest joy was also the thing that very nearly led her to the stake, and in that terrible irony we see the whole peril of her position, the queen who served her God so faithfully and was so nearly destroyed for it. But before we come to that grave danger, we must follow Catherine to the height of her power, to the moment when she governed England itself. For in the summer of 1544, Henry placed in her hands an authority he had given to none of his wives since Catherine of Aragon, and the way she used it revealed the full measure of who she was. Let us return, in fuller detail, to the summer of 1544, to the months when she governed England as regent, for it was the highest point of her power and the fullest demonstration of her capability, and it deserves to be seen clearly. The occasion was the king's decision to go to war in France, to lead an army across the Channel in person, in one last attempt to recapture the martial glory of his youth. It was a strange and reckless enterprise for a man so old and so sick, but Henry was determined to have his war, and in the summer of that year he crossed to France at the head of his army, leaving England behind him. And the question, of course, was who would govern the kingdom in his absence, for a realm could not be left to run itself, and the king's departure created a vacancy at the very centre of rule that had to be filled. Henry's choice fell upon his wife. He named Catherine as regent, as governor of the land in his absence, placing in her hands the power to rule England while he was away at war. This was a mark of extraordinary trust, and a measure of how highly Henry valued Catherine's judgment and capability, for the regency was no mere ceremonial honour, but an actual grant of governing power. As regent, she held genuine authority over the realm, and she exercised it actively and well throughout the months of his absence. She presided over the council, the body of leading men who administered it, working with them to manage the affairs of government. She signed royal proclamations in her own name, issuing the formal acts by which the kingdom was governed. She oversaw the administration of justice and finance, the ordinary business of running a vast realm, and she attended, in particular, to the defence of the borders, for with the king and his army in France, England was vulnerable, and there were dangers to be guarded against, especially in the north, where the Scots' old enemies and sometime allies of France posed a constant threat. She managed the defence of the country, corresponded with the commanders on the borders, attended to the security of the land, and did it all with a calm competence that drew the admiration of those who worked with her. What is striking in the record of her regency is how naturally and how well she took to the exercise of power, how the woman who had run noble households and survived rebellion proved equally capable of governing a kingdom. There is no sign of hesitation or incapacity, no suggestion that the burden was too heavy for her. Rather, she governed with assurance and skill, mastering the business of state, working effectively with the council, handling the weighty affairs of the realm with a competence that justified the king's trust completely. She corresponded with Henry himself during these months, her letters revealing a woman fully engaged with the business of governing, on top of the affairs of state, managing its concerns with intelligence and care. The clever girl from the northern schoolroom, it turned out, had in her the makings of a true ruler, and given the chance to govern, she governed well, revealing a capacity for statecraft that few would have expected in a woman of her age, and that fewer still would have been given the opportunity to display. The regency matters not only as the high point of Catherine's own power, but as a demonstration, in an age that doubted it, that a woman could govern, and govern well, and that demonstration was not lost on the watchful young Elizabeth, who would one day need to prove the same feat on a far larger stage. Here was a woman, exercising genuine authority over a kingdom, managing its government and its defence, working with its leading men, conducting its affairs with skill and assurance, and doing all of it as well as any man might have done. In an age that held women incapable of rule, that doubted whether a woman could ever govern a realm, Catherine's regency was a quiet but powerful refutation, a proof by example that a capable and educated woman could wield supreme power competently, and the girl who watched her do it, the young Elizabeth growing up in her household, would carry that example forward into her own extraordinary reign, when she would govern England not for a few months as a regent, but for nearly half a century as a queen in her own right, proving on the grandest scale what Catherine had shown in miniature, that a woman could rule, and rule magnificently. The regency of 1544 was Catherine at her most powerful, and it was also, in a sense, a rehearsal, watched by the girl who would one day surpass it. Let us return in fuller detail to the gravest crisis of Catherine's life, the heresy plot that so nearly destroyed her, for it is a drama of extraordinary tension and a perfect illustration of the deadly games of the Tudor court, and it deserves to be told slowly. The plot arose from the deep religious division at court, and from the alarm of the conservative faction at the influence of the reforming queen. By the last years of Henry's reign, the Conservatives, led by the formidable Bishop Gardiner and the Lord Chancellor Wriothesley, had grown deeply worried about the direction of policy of faith and about the Queen's part in it. They saw Catherine surrounded by her circle of like-minded women, promoting the new ideas of faith, even, it seemed, influencing the king toward reform, and they determined that she must be brought down before her influence could shape the coming reign of the young prince. They needed a weapon, and the weapon they chose was the charge of heresy, the accusation that the Queen held and promoted beliefs that went beyond what the law allowed, beliefs that could be called heretical, and that against the wife of a king who burned heretics could prove fatal. And the Conservatives worked patiently and cleverly, and they found their opening, as such schemers so often did, in the king's own irritation. For Catherine, in her fervour, had grown bold, too bold, in discussing matters of faith with her husband. She would debate religion with him, press her reforming views, even gently argue with him, and seek to move him toward her own opinions. And Henry, old and sick and in pain, Increasingly conservative in his own beliefs, never a man to brook contradiction, had begun to find this presumption from his wife irritating, even offensive. On one occasion, it is said, after Catherine had pressed her views rather too far, the king grumbled his displeasure, complaining that it had come to a fine pass when he should be lectured on religion by his wife. The Conservatives, ever watchful, caught wind of Henry's irritation, and they seized upon it, working to inflame it, suggesting that a wife who presumed to instruct her husband and her king on matters of faith was not merely irritating but dangerous, perhaps even heretical, and that her beliefs ought to be examined. And they pressed the king, in his irritation, to authorize an investigation into the Queen's faith. Henry, irritated and perhaps half persuaded, gave way, and the machinery of destruction was set in motion. Articles were drawn up against the Queen, charging her with heresy. An investigation was authorized, and most dangerous of all, a warrant was prepared for her arrest, so that she might be taken and examined, and if the charges held, destroyed. The trap was fully laid. The Queen was marked for arrest, the documents prepared, the Conservatives poised to strike, and she, all unknowing, stood on the very edge of the abyss, as close to destruction as Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard had ever been. Had the plot proceeded as her enemies intended, she might have followed those women to the Tower and beyond, accused of heresy, examined, condemned, perhaps burned at the stake, the reforming Queen destroyed by the Conservative faction in the lethal religious wars of the court. It was a moment of the utmost peril, and she knew nothing of it, going about her business as the trap closed silently around her. But fortune and Catherine's own cleverness intervened to save her, for the warrant for her arrest, or a copy of the articles against her, was dropped or mislaid, and came into the hands of someone loyal to the Queen, who brought it to her, warning her of the deadly danger she was in. Imagine the terror of that moment, the Queen suddenly learning that she was marked for arrest on a charge of heresy, that the machinery of her destruction was already in motion, that she stood where two of her predecessors had stood before their deaths. By the accounts that survive, she was at first overcome with fear, falling into such distress and terror that she made herself genuinely ill, taking to her bed in an agony of dread. It was a natural response to so deadly a danger, and for a moment it seemed that the reforming Queen would go the way of the others, destroyed by Henry's displeasure and her enemies' scheming. But she was not a woman to be undone by fear, and out of her very terror she found her way to a plan, a clever and humble and brilliant plan by which she would turn the whole deadly business aside and save her own life through nothing but the sharpness of her wit. That plan, and its triumphant success, is the finest moment in all her remarkable story, and we shall come to it next. But Catherine Parr was not Catherine Howard, was not a frightened girl with no resources, and the manner of her escape is one of the cleverest and most satisfying episodes in all the long saga of Henry's wives, a triumph of wit and nerve over the machinery of death. For she learned of her danger in time, by good fortune, when a copy of the articles against her was dropped or discovered and brought to her, warning her of the trap that had been laid. And on learning that she was marked for destruction, Catherine did not panic, did not flee, did not rage, but thought coolly and cleverly about how she might save herself. She took to her bed, gave out that she was ill with fear and distress, and when the king, hearing of her illness, came to visit her, she played her part to perfection. And then, when the moment came, she turned the whole accusation on its head with a piece of brilliant and humble cunning that reveals the full sharpness of her mind. The plan that she devised out of her very terror reveals the full brilliance of her mind, the sharpness and the subtlety that made her the survivor. She understood that her danger came from Henry's irritation at her religious boldness, at her presumption in debating and instructing him, and she understood that the way to safety lay in reversing that impression entirely, in transforming herself from the bold instructress into the humble pupil, in flattering Henry's vanity and disarming the charge against her through a complete and calculated submission. And so, when the king came to visit her in her feigned illness, Catherine played her part to perfection. Henry, perhaps testing her, perhaps still annoyed, drew her into a discussion of religion, inviting her to debate as she had so often debated before, but she did not take the bait. Instead, she abased herself wholly, declaring that she was but a poor weak woman, subject in all things to her husband's wisdom, that it was not for her to instruct her lord and king, but rather to be instructed by him, that if she had ever seemed to argue with him on religion, it had only been to take his mind off his pain, and perhaps to learn from his superior wisdom by hearing him refute her. It was a masterpiece of strategic humility, a complete surrender that flattered Henry's vanity, soothed his irritation, and disarmed the charge against her entirely, for she could hardly be a dangerous heretic who presumed to teach, having declared herself a humble woman who sought only to be taught. The king, hearing this submission, was completely won over. His irritation melted, his affection returned, and he declared, delighted, that they were perfect friends again, embracing his clever and now apparently humble wife. But the danger was not yet past, for the machinery of her destruction had been set in motion before her reconciliation with the king, and the Chancellor and his men, knowing nothing of the change, were still preparing to arrest her. And so came the final scene, the most satisfying moment of the whole drama, when her deliverance was sealed in the most public and humiliating fashion for her enemies. On the day after her reconciliation with the king, she was walking with Henry in the garden, the two of them restored to perfect friendship, when the Lord Chancellor Wriothesley arrived with a guard of soldiers to arrest the Queen. Knowing nothing of what had passed between her and the king, he had come to seize the Queen and carry her off to the Tower, exactly as the Conservatives had planned, and he arrived to find her walking arm in arm with the king, restored to favour, the whole plot already undone. The king's fury at the Chancellor was terrible and complete, and it sealed Catherine's triumph utterly. Henry, seeing the Chancellor come to arrest the wife with whom he was now perfectly reconciled, turned on Wriothesley in a rage, berating him, calling him a knave and a fool and worse, driving him away in humiliation and disgrace. The Chancellor, who had come to destroy the Queen, was himself sent packing, abused and disgraced, his plot collapsed, his scheme turned to ashes. And Catherine, the Queen who had stood on the very edge of destruction, was saved completely, restored to the king's full favour, her enemies routed and humiliated, her own life secured by nothing but the brilliance of her own wit and the steadiness of her own nerve. It was a total triumph, the finest hour of the survivor, and it showed exactly why she, of all the 6 wives, was the one who lived. Where Catherine Howard had run screaming and helpless toward a king who would not hear her, Catherine Parr had thought and planned and performed and saved herself, turning certain destruction into renewed favour through the sheer power of her extraordinary mind. It was survival earned by genius, and it remains one of the most satisfying episodes in all the long saga of Henry's wives, the moment when the cleverest of them outwitted them all and walked free. And Frustix, after that great crisis, she was more careful, and she kept her place safely through the last months of the king's life, nursing the dying tyrant through his final decline. For Henry was failing now, his vast body breaking down at last, his health collapsing, and through those final months she tended him, the patient and dutiful wife, caring for the difficult and failing old man as his life drew to its close. And in the early days of 1547, Henry VIII died at last, the ogre of a king who had married 6 women and destroyed so many of them, dying in his bed, swollen and ruined, the terror of his reign finally lifted from the kingdom. And she had survived. She had done what none of the others, save the long-departed Anne of Cleves, had managed. She had married Henry VIII and outlived him, come through the most perilous marriage in the kingdom alive and free, survived the heresy plot and Henry's wrath and all the perils of her position, and emerged at the end as the Dowager Queen, wealthy, honoured, and at last, after so many years of duty and danger, free. She was perhaps 35 years old, still in the prime of her life, and for the first time since her girlhood she was her own mistress, at liberty to live as she chose, and at last to marry where her heart led. And her heart, of course, led straight back to Thomas Seymour, the man she had loved and given up 4 years before, the love she had set aside to do her duty to the king. Now the king was dead, and she was free, and Thomas Seymour was still there, still unmarried, still ambitious and dashing and attractive, and the old attachment between them rekindled at once, with all the urgency of a passion long denied. Thomas Seymour had risen high in the new reign, for his nephew, the little Edward, was now king, and Seymour was the king's uncle, a man of power and ambition in the new order. He had reportedly considered seeking the hand of one of the princesses, even of the young Elizabeth, in his ambition, but it was to Catherine that he turned or returned, and the two of them, finding their old love undimmed, married with what many thought indecent haste, only months after the old king's death. It was a match of the heart, the marriage that she had wanted years before and been denied, and for a brief while it seems to have made her genuinely happy, the woman who had done her duty for so long finally claiming a happiness of her own, married at last to the man she had truly loved. Let us linger a moment on the brief happiness of Catherine's last marriage, on the months after the old king's death when she was free at last and married to the man she loved, for it was the one time in her long dutiful life when she reached for something purely for herself, and it deserves to be remembered with tenderness, even though it ended in sorrow. For most of her life, Catherine had done her duty, had wed where she was told, had set aside her own wishes for the demands of family and king. Her first 2 marriages had been arrangements, sensible matches made for her by others. Her third, to Henry, had been an obligation she could not refuse, a sacrifice of the love she had found for the service of the crown. 3 times she had been a wife, and never once had she wed for her own heart's sake. And then, when Henry died and she was free, she did at last what she had never been able to do before. She wed for love, chose her own husband, claimed a joy of her own choosing. There must have been, in those first months of her marriage to Thomas Seymour, a sweetness that she had never known, the joy of being with the man she had loved and longed for through all her years of duty, the pleasure of a marriage made by her own choice and for her own happiness. After so long setting her own wishes aside, she had finally claimed something for herself, and the claiming of it must have brought a joy that her dutiful marriages had never offered. She was a woman in her mid-30s, free and wealthy and admired, with him at last, the man she loved, and for a while, before the troubles came, she must have tasted a sweetness that had been denied her all her life. There is something deeply moving in the thought of it, this serious, dutiful, much-tried woman finally allowing herself a joy of her own, reaching for love after all the years of duty, and finding it, however briefly, in her own home, with the man she had wanted for so long. That the joy was spoiled, that Seymour proved unworthy, and the marriage brought grief as well as joy, does not cancel the sweetness of those first months, nor the rightness of Catherine's reaching for happiness at last. She had earned it, surely, after all her long service and danger, the right to a joy of her own, and if the joy proved imperfect, if the man she chose disappointed her, That is a sorrow but not a reproach. She had done everything that had been asked of her, served faithfully through danger and difficulty, and when at last she was free, she did what any human heart would do, reached for the love she had longed for, sought a happiness of her own. The disappointments that followed were not her fault, but Seymour's, the failure of an unworthy man to deserve the devotion of a remarkable woman, and the reaching itself, the claiming of joy after so long, remains one of the most human and most touching things about her whole story. And there is a particular poignancy in the fact that this reaching for joy led through the child it brought to her death, for the pregnancy that was the fruit of her marriage to Seymour was also the cause of her end. She had reached out, and love had given her the daughter she had always wanted, and that very gift had cost her her life. There is something almost mythic in the shape of it, the woman who finally claims her own happiness and is destroyed by the very prize she claimed, the joy and the doom bound together inextricably, the longing leading to motherhood and motherhood to the grave. It gives her story the shape of tragedy in the oldest sense, the sense in which the very thing the hero most desires becomes the instrument of their fall. Catherine had wanted love, and a child of her own, longed for them, through all her years of service, and when at last she had them, they killed her. But even so, even knowing how it ended, we cannot wish that she had not reached for them, for the reaching was right and human and brave, and the brief joy was real, and a life without that reaching would have been a poorer thing, however much longer it might have lasted. But the marriage to Thomas Seymour, which should have been her reward for all her years of duty and danger, proved instead to be the beginning of her final sorrows, for Seymour, whatever her love for him, was not worthy of her. He was ambitious and reckless and self-serving, a man on the make, who had risen high and craved to rise higher, and his conduct in the months that followed brought trouble and grief into a home that should have known only peace. There was a darkness in him that her long love had not let her see, a recklessness that would in time undo him entirely, and the discovery of it, in the very season of her late happiness, cast a shadow over what should have been the brightest chapter of her life. We shall come to the particulars shortly, for they are a necessary part of the story, but it is enough for now to say that the man she had waited for and longed for proved in the having a grief as much as a joy. And yet into that troubled season came the one consolation she had never known in all her years, the thing she had wanted above all others, for Catherine, at long last, was expecting a child. We must look more closely at Thomas Seymour, the man Catherine loved, for he is a crucial figure in her story, the great love and the great mistake of her life, and his character explains much about the sorrows of her final year. Thomas Seymour was a man of considerable charm and considerable ambition, and very little judgment or principle to balance them. He was the brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour, and therefore the uncle of Prince Edward, the heir to the throne, a connection that placed him near the centre of power and fed an ambition that was already large. He was handsome, dashing, bold, attractive, a man who made a strong impression, full of energy and charm, and a kind of reckless confidence. Women found him attractive, and Catherine, the serious and learned and dutiful woman, fell deeply under his spell, drawn perhaps by exactly the qualities that were most unlike her own careful seriousness, his boldness, his charm, his dash. He was the romance of her life, the man who awoke in her a passion that her dutiful marriages had never touched. But Thomas Seymour was also, beneath the charm, a deeply flawed and finally a dangerous man, ambitious beyond his abilities, reckless, self-serving, lacking the judgment and the principle that might have made his ambitions safe. He wanted advancement above all things, and he was not scrupulous about how he pursued them. When the old king died and his young nephew became king, Seymour found himself uncle to a boy king close to the throne, and his ambition swelled dangerously. His elder brother, Edward Seymour, became Lord Protector, the effective ruler of England during the king's minority, and Thomas, consumed with jealousy of his brother, schemed and plotted to advance himself, to gain a share of the rule he craved. He married Catherine, in part, surely for love, for the old attraction was real, but also, it has been suggested, with an eye to her wealth and her position and her closeness to the king's children, for Seymour never did anything without an eye to his own advantage. And his conduct in the marriage, his reckless ambition, and his improper behaviour brought trouble and grief just when she had most reason to hope for happiness. The matter of his conduct toward the young Elizabeth, which we have touched upon, reveals the worst of Seymour, and it casts a dark shadow over her final year. Elizabeth, the princess, a girl of about 14, was living with Catherine after her marriage to Seymour, under her stepmother's care, and Seymour's behaviour toward her became inappropriate and troubling in ways that caused real distress, and that reflected very badly indeed upon a man in his position. It was a grave matter, a grave failure of the responsibility that a man owed to a girl in his household, and it placed Catherine in a painful and difficult position, caught between her husband and her stepdaughter. We need not dwell on the particulars, which are uncomfortable, but the situation grew serious enough that Catherine, to protect the young Elizabeth, eventually sent her away from the household, removing her from a situation that had become untenable. That she acted to protect Elizabeth speaks well of her care for the girl and her sound judgment. But the whole business cast a shadow over what should have been her happy marriage, revealing the unworthiness of the man she had loved so long and bringing distress and difficulty into her household at the worst possible time. Thomas Seymour's reckless ambition would, in the end, destroy him, though that came after her death, and so falls outside the main course of her story. After she died, his schemes and plots grew ever more reckless, his ambition ever more dangerous, until at last he overreached so badly, plotting and scheming against his brother and the government, that he was arrested, condemned for treason, and executed, brought down by the very ambition that had driven him all his life. It was a fitting end, perhaps, for a man whose reach so far exceeded his judgment, and it confirmed what her final year had already revealed, that the man she had loved so deeply was not worthy of her, that her great romance had been bestowed upon a charming and reckless and ultimately worthless object. There is a sadness in this, that Catherine, who deserved so much, who was so admirable in so many ways, should have given her heart to a man so unworthy of it, should have waited and longed for him through her years of duty, only to find, when at last she had him, that he brought her grief and trouble rather than the happiness she had earned. The great love of her life was the great misjudgment of her life, and it clouded her final year and her final days, the one serious failure of judgment in a life otherwise marked by such wisdom and capability. For here, amid the troubles of her marriage, came the one experience Catherine had never known in all her years and all her marriages. For though she had been a wife 4 times over and a stepmother again and again, she had never borne one of her own, and now, in her mid-30s, wedded at last to the man she loved, she found herself pregnant for the first time in her life. It must have been a moment of profound joy and wonder for her, this late and longed-for gift she had never thought to have, coming to her at last in the autumn of her years. After all the years of serving and tending and raising the children of others, she was to have a babe of her very own, and her happiness at the prospect, despite the troubles with Seymour, must have been very great indeed. To carry a babe of her own body, at last, after so long a life given to the children and the households of other people, must have felt like a kind of homecoming, a gift she had ceased to expect arriving when she had all but given up hoping for it. But here, at the very threshold of this last and most personal joy, her story turns, with a cruel suddenness, toward its sorrowful end. Let me bring you to Sudeley Castle, where her story came to its end, for it is a place worth knowing, and her time there and her death there form the quiet and sorrowful close of her extraordinary life. Sudeley was a castle in the green county of Gloucestershire, in the gentle countryside of the English West, a fine and ancient residence set among rolling hills and rich farmland, far from the dangers and intrigues of the court. It had come into the possession of Thomas Seymour, and after his marriage to Catherine it became their country home, the place where the Dowager Queen settled with her new husband, away from the wide world, to await the birth of her baby. After all the years of duty and danger, after the perils of court and the strain of her marriages, she came at last to this quiet country home, to settle into the role she had so long been denied, that of an expectant mother in her own home. And for a while, despite the troubles with Seymour, Sudeley must have offered her a measure of the peace and the domestic contentment she had so rarely known. It was at Sudeley, in the late summer of 1548, that Catherine's daughter was born, the little girl she named Mary, the first and only child of all her years and all her marriages. We can imagine the joy of it, the longed-for daughter come at last, the woman who had raised so many other women's offspring finally holding a babe of her own, in the peace of her country home, with the hard years behind her, and, it must have seemed, a gentler future ahead. For a few days Catherine had what she had always wanted, the baby, the home, the husband she had loved, the peace of the countryside, the whole shape of an ordinary domestic peace that the long drama of her life had so long denied her. After everything she had endured and achieved, the survivor had come at last to a calm harbour with her child in her arms. To understand the end of her story, and the danger that claimed her, it helps to understand the world of childbirth in her age, the rituals and the perils of bringing a child into the world in the 16th century, for it was a process surrounded by ceremony and shadowed by death, and she passed through all of it in her final weeks. When a woman of rank approached her time, she would withdraw from the world into a period of confinement, retiring some weeks before the expected birth into a specially prepared chamber, there to await her delivery in seclusion. The chamber would be made ready according to custom, hung with tapestries, kept warm and dim, a sealed and enclosed and female space into which the expectant woman withdrew, attended by her women, cut off from the ordinary life of the household, given over wholly to the perilous business of birth. It was a ritual of withdrawal and preparation, this confinement, marking the passage into the perilous days of delivery, and Catherine, in the late summer of her last year, withdrew into it at Sudeley, retiring to await the birth of her child. The birth itself, when it came, was attended by the women who served as midwives and helpers, for this was a female mystery from which men were excluded, the bringing of new life conducted by women in the enclosed chamber of confinement. There was little that the medical understanding of the age could do to ease the dangers or the pain of birth, no real means of preventing the infections and complications that so often followed, no understanding of the causes of the fevers that killed so many mothers in the days after delivery. The women did what they could with their experience and their traditional knowledge, but they were largely helpless against the dangers, and each birth was a passage through real and mortal peril. The mother delivered, if she was fortunate, of a living babe, and surviving, if she was fortunate, the perilous days that followed. She came through the birth itself, was delivered of her daughter, the longed-for babe, and for a few days all seemed well, she herself recovering, the babe thriving, the danger seemingly past. But the worst was not past, for it was in the days after birth that the greatest peril often lay in the childbed fever that could follow delivery, the infection that the age could neither understand nor prevent nor cure. Within days of her delivery, she fell ill with this fever, the infection taking hold, her temperature rising, her condition worsening, and there was nothing that anyone could do to save her. The fever ran its course as such fevers did, and Catherine, who had survived so much, could not survive this. The chief destroyer of mothers, against which no cleverness or courage or care could prevail. She sank over the days of her illness toward death, the longed for happiness of her motherhood turning with terrible swiftness into the approach of her own end, the joy of her child's birth shadowed and then overwhelmed by the fever that would kill her. But the harbour proved a false one, for childbirth in that age was the chief destroyer of women, and Catherine, who had come through so much, did not survive it. Within days of the birth she fell ill with the childbed fever, the infection that so commonly followed delivery in those days when nothing was understood of how to prevent it, and it became swiftly clear that she would not recover. The fever took hold, her strength failed, and the woman who had come through rebellion and heresy plots, and the wrath of the most dangerous king in the world, lay dying in her bed at Sudeley, struck down by the commonest peril of womanhood at the very moment of her greatest personal joy. It was a cruel and a sudden ending, the more cruel for coming, just when she had finally grasped the happiness she had so long been denied, the child and the home and the love all hers at last, and then her life slipping away from her in the fever, all of it to be left behind almost as soon as it was won. There is a painful detail from her final days, in her fever and her delirium, that reveals the sorrow that had crept into her marriage, for it is recorded that in her illness she spoke wandering, troubled words, reproaching those around her, even seeming to reproach her husband Seymour, as though the disappointments of her marriage rose up in her fevered mind at the last. Whether we should make too much of the words of a dying woman in the grip of fever is uncertain, but they suggest a sadness beneath the surface of her final months, a grief that her long-awaited happiness had been spoiled by the unworthiness of the man she had loved. And yet she also, by other accounts, met her end with the same faith and dignity that had marked her whole life, commending her soul to God, dying as she had lived, a woman of deep belief facing death with courage. She died at Sudeley on the 5th of September 1548, only a few days after the birth of her daughter, at the age of about 36, and she was buried in the chapel of the castle, in the still country place where she had spent her last months. It was a fitting resting spot in a way, this peaceful country chapel, far from the grim ground of the Tower where two of Henry's wives lay, far from the royal mausoleums, a still and gentle place for a woman who had earned a calm and gentle rest. She is the only one of Henry's 6 wives to be buried in such a place, in a private chapel in the countryside, and there is something appropriate in that distinction, for she was in so many ways set apart from the others, the survivor, the scholar, the woman who had made her own way and lived her own life. She lies there still, in the chapel at Sudeley, in the green Gloucestershire hills, the last and in many ways the finest of the 6 wives of Henry VIII, at rest at last after her long and remarkable and finally sorrowful life. And in that quiet country chapel, far from the wide world that had used and tested her so hard, there is a kind of peace that suits her, the peace that came at last to the woman who had endured so much and asked in the end for so little. There is a deep and particular poignancy in the manner of her death when you set it against the whole shape of her life, for she had survived everything and then died of the one peril she could not survive. She had outlived the terrible king, escaped the scaffold that took 2 of her predecessors, survived the heresy plot that should have destroyed her, come through every threat that the most perilous court in the land could throw at her, and emerged free and alive and, at the very end, happy, with the love and the child she had always wanted. And then, at the very moment of her greatest personal joy, She was struck down by the commonest fate of women in that age. Dead in childbed like so many thousands of ordinary women, the survivor brought low at last, not by king or scaffold or plot, but by the simple act of becoming a mother. There is something almost unbearably sad in it, that she should escape every extraordinary danger only to fall to the most ordinary one, that she should win her freedom and her love and her child, and then lose her life in the having of them. She died with so much still before her, the dowager queen, the scholar, the survivor, gone at 36 in the bearing of her first and only child. Her death in childbed, when we set it in the context of her age, opens onto a larger and a sadder truth about the shadow that lay across every woman's life in that age, and about what the women who married into the House of Tudor faced in particular. For all the differences between the 6 wives, all the variety of their characters and their fates, they were united by one fact, that their lives and bodies were bound up in the bearing of children, the business that the whole dynastic system demanded of them, and that could so easily kill them. Childbirth was perhaps the gravest thing an ordinary woman faced, for the medicine of the time was helpless against the infections and complications that so often followed birth. Women perished in childbed in vast numbers, in every rank of society, from the poorest cottager to the queen herself, and each one who became pregnant knew that she was entering into mortal peril, that the giving of life might cost her own. For royal and noble women, this universal danger was compounded by the relentless pressure to bear children, and especially to bear sons, for the whole edifice of dynastic politics rested upon the production of male heirs. A queen's first duty was to provide her king with a son, to secure the succession, to continue the dynasty, and a queen who failed in this was a queen who had failed entirely, whatever her other qualities. The whole tragedy of Henry's marriages had begun, in a sense, from exactly this pressure, from his desperate need for a male heir and the failure of his first wife to provide one, and that need had driven the entire bloody saga of his 6 marriages. The women he married were valued, above all, for their wombs, for their capacity to bear the sons the dynasty required, and their fates were bound up inescapably with the perilous business of childbearing. Jane Seymour had perished of it, giving Henry his longed-for son and paying for it with her life. And now Catherine Parr, the last of the 6, succumbed to it too, bearing her first child at last and losing her life in the having of it. There is something in this end that joins Catherine to a vast and silent company, for in dying as she did, she shared the fate of countless thousands of women whose names we shall never know. The cottager in her cold cabin, and the queen in her curtained chamber, faced in this one respect exactly the same trial, and the same fate could claim them both. All the things that set Catherine apart, her learning, her crown, her courage, her place at the summit of the realm, counted for nothing against this most common of perils, which levelled the highest and the humblest alike, and bound them together in a single sisterhood of risk. There is a strange and sombre dignity in that the most accomplished woman of her age should go out of the world by the same door as the poorest, and it lends her death a meaning beyond her own story, making her, in her ending, a kind of representative of all the women who ever paid that price. When we remember her, we may remember them too. The great multitude of mothers lost to the bearing of their children, of whom Catherine, for all her distinction, was in the end simply one, and so Catherine's death, for all its individual sorrow, stands also as a kind of emblem of the condition of women in her age, of the danger that attended the very act that women were most valued and most pressured to do. She was a queen, learned and capable and admired, who had governed a kingdom and written books and faced down deadly enemies, and yet in the end she went as countless ordinary women went, in childbed, brought low by the universal peril of her sex. There is something that levels and unites in that, the queen and the cottager facing the same mortal peril, the same risk attending the birth of a royal child and a peasant's. And Catherine, for all her distinction, shared in the end the common fate of so many women of her time. Her death reminds us that beneath all the drama of kings and queens and courts, the women of that age lived always with this shadow that could take any of them at any time, and that even the highest and the most accomplished were not exempt. The survivor who had escaped so much was claimed, in the end, by the danger that no woman could escape, and in her death we may remember not only her own loss, but the countless women, named and nameless, who paid the same price across the long centuries of that universal peril. There is a remarkable symmetry in the story of the king's wives, a kind of closing of the circle that becomes visible only when we set the last of them beside the first, and it is worth pausing on, for it gives Parr's story a fitting place in the whole long drama. The two who bracket the great procession shared, as we saw at the very beginning, a single name, the one a Spanish princess Henry took in the bright morning of his reign, the other a northern gentlewoman he took in its dark decline. But the echo runs deeper than the name they held in common. Set the first wife and the last side by side, and you find them rhyming in ways that the 25 years between them might have been expected to dissolve. Two figures answering each other across the whole strange span of the king's marrying, the beginning and the end of it caught in a single mirrored pair. And the symmetry runs deeper than the name, for there is a kind of rhyme between the first wife and the last, in the very shape of their characters and their fates. Both were women of unusual learning and piety, serious and dignified and devout, the two most formidable and admirable of the six in the strength of their characters and the depth of their minds. Both were capable women who could have governed, and in a sense did, for the Spanish queen had served as regent in her time as Parr would serve as regent in hers, both of them entrusted with the rule of the kingdom, both governing well. Both were women who faced terrible adversity with courage and dignity, the Spanish queen enduring the long cruelty of her rejection with unbroken pride, the northern one facing the heresy plot with nerve and wit. They stand, the first wife and the last, as a matched pair of remarkable women, the two strongest and most admirable of the six, bracketing the strange and terrible procession of Henry's marriages, the Spanish princess and the northern gentlewoman, united by that name and by character across the whole span of the king's marital career. But there is a great difference too, the difference that makes Parr's story end so differently from the first queen's, and it lies in the single word that the old rhyme gives the last wife: survived. The first Catherine was destroyed by Henry, cast aside and humiliated, and left to die in lonely exile, the first of his victims. Parr survived him, outlived him, came through her marriage to him alive and free, the one who got away. The first Catherine was broken by the king, the last Catherine outlasted him, and in that difference we can read the whole arc of the king's reign and his decline. From the powerful young king who could destroy a Spanish princess and defy the Pope and all of Europe, to the failing old tyrant whose last wife nursed him to his grave and walked away free. The wheel that had begun with Catherine of Aragon's destruction ended with Catherine Parr's survival, the first wife crushed and the last wife free, and there is a kind of justice in that closing, that the terrible saga that began with the cruel discarding of one good woman should end with another good woman outliving the man who had caused so much suffering. So Catherine Parr holds a special place among the six, not only as the survivor, the one who lived, but as the closing of the circle, the last wife who carried the first wife's name and shared the first wife's strength and reversed the first wife's fate. She was the end of the long story, the final chapter of Henry's marriages, and she ended it well, surviving the king, outliving the terror, claiming at the last a measure of freedom and even of happiness before her own sorrowful end. Among the six, she was the one who escaped, the one who was not destroyed by the king, the one who lived to see him buried and to make, however briefly, a life of her own beyond him. And she was, take her all in all, perhaps the worthiest of them to be the one who survived. For of all the six she was the most fully herself, the most accomplished, the most admirable, the woman who deserved most to escape his destruction and to live. The wheel came round to Catherine at the last, and it was fitting that it should, the last wife bearing the first wife's name, closing the long circle, surviving where the first had been destroyed, the final and the finest of the six. Let us set Catherine for a moment beside the other five wives, the women who went before her in the king's bed and in his story, for in comparing her with them we see most clearly what set her apart, and why she stands, at the last, as perhaps the finest of the six. Each of the wives had her own distinct character and her own distinct fate, and together they form a kind of gallery of the different ways a woman might be caught up in the deadly business of marriage to Henry VIII. There was Catherine of Aragon, the proud and pious Spanish princess, dignified and devout, destroyed by his need for a son and his desire for another woman, enduring her long cruelty with unbroken pride. There was Anne Boleyn, clever and ambitious and bold, who reached for the crown and won it and then lost everything, beheaded when the king turned against her. There was Jane Seymour, quiet and meek and dutiful, who gave the king his son and died of it. There was Anne of Cleves, shrewd and sensible, who was rejected and survived by her wisdom and lived long and comfortable. And there was Catherine Howard, young and reckless and undereducated, the tragic girl undone by her own folly and the failures of those around her. And then there was Parr herself, and when we set her beside the others, we see at once how she combined and surpassed their various qualities, how she was, in a sense, the fullest and most complete of them all. She had the learning and the piety of Catherine of Aragon, but joined to a reforming faith and a literary gift the Spanish queen never had. She had something of the cleverness of Anne Boleyn, but a cleverness joined to wisdom and prudence rather than reckless ambition, a cleverness that saved her life rather than destroying it. She had the dutifulness of Jane Seymour, but joined to an intellectual and spiritual depth that Jane never showed. She had the shrewd survival instinct of Anne of Cleves, the ability to read danger and navigate it, but joined to a far richer character and a far greater achievement. And she had none of the reckless folly of Catherine Howard, being instead the most prudent and self-possessed of all the six. She gathered up, in a sense, the best qualities of the women who had gone before her, and joined them in a character more complete and more accomplished than any of theirs. The comparison illuminates, too, the different fates that the six wives met, and Catherine's distinctive place among them in this respect as well. 2 of the wives were destroyed by the king, cast aside or beheaded. 1 died in his service, giving him his heir. 2 outlived him, Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr, the wise survivors who outlasted the perilous king. But of the 2 survivors, Catherine Parr is the more remarkable, for Anne of Cleves came through by being rejected, by being set aside and sent away to a quiet and comfortable obscurity, while she endured by remaining the king's wife to the end, nursing him through his decline, navigating the deadly perils of her position, and emerging at his death as the Dowager Queen, honoured and free. Anne of Cleves came through by escaping the marriage. Catherine prevailed by mastering it, by holding her dangerous position to the end and coming through alive. Hers was the harder and the more impressive survival, the survival not of the woman who got out, but of the woman who stayed in and prevailed, and it marks her as the most capable of all the 6 in the actual navigation of the perils of being Henry's wife. And so the comparison comes to rest on this one point above all, that of the 2 wives who outlived Henry, Catherine alone outlived him from within the marriage rather than from outside it. To set her beside Anne of Cleves is to see the difference plainly. Cleves saved herself by being let go, by stepping out of the dangerous circle altogether into a quiet and comfortable retirement, and there was real wisdom in that, and no little luck. But Catherine stayed. She remained the king's wife to the very end, in the closest and most perilous proximity to his power, and she came through not by escaping the danger, but by mastering it day after day, until at last he died, and she stood free. That is the rarer and the harder achievement, to hold the most dangerous place in the kingdom, and not merely survive it, but fill it with such dignity and competence that the survival looks, in hindsight, almost easy. It was not easy. It was the work of a singular nerve and a singular mind, and it sets her apart even from the one other wife who shared her good fortune in outliving the king who had married them both. There is a deeper question worth sitting with as we contemplate the life of the wife who survived, and it is the question of what survival cost her, of what it meant to be the one who lived through what destroyed the others, for it is not always the simple blessing it appears. She survived, where Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard were destroyed, and to endure is, of course, far better than to be destroyed, far better to live than to die upon the scaffold. But to come through for Catherine exacted a cost, demanded sacrifices and accommodations that were their own kind of suffering, and it is worth understanding what it took for her to be the one who lived. It took, first, the sacrifice of her own happiness. For to survive, she had to set aside the love she had found with Thomas Seymour and bind herself instead to a king she could not have desired. The very thing that put her on the path to safety, her marriage to Henry, was itself a sacrifice, the giving up of her own heart's wish for the demands of duty and the king's command. To be the queen who survived, she first had to become the queen who had renounced her own happiness, who had set aside love for duty, who had taken up the perilous burden of marriage to the aging tyrant. It began in sacrifice, in the renunciation of her own desires, and that renunciation was a real cost, a real suffering, the giving up of the joy she had finally found for the sake of a duty she could not escape. It took, too, a toll that we can only guess at, the slow inward cost of years lived under unceasing strain. To hold her place beside Henry was to be always, every waking hour, on her guard, never able to relax into the simple trust that an ordinary marriage allows, never free of the knowledge that a careless word might be her last. We do not often think of what such vigilance does to a person over years, the weariness of perpetual self-watching, the loneliness of a life in which one can never be wholly candid, never wholly safe, never wholly at rest. Catherine bore it with such grace that those around her may scarcely have seen the burden, but it must have weighed on her heavily, this constant guarding of her every word and look, and it is one of the hidden costs of her survival that we should not forget. She paid for her life with a watchfulness that never slept, and that is a price few of us could imagine bearing for a single year, let alone 4. And survival meant, in the end, that Catherine carried the weight of having outlived so much, of being the one who remained when others had fallen, and there is a particular burden in that, in being the survivor. She had seen the young Catherine Howard go to the scaffold the year before her own marriage. She had known the history of all the wives who had gone before, the destroyed and the discarded. She had lived among the ghosts of those women, in the very palaces where they had reigned and fallen, the wife who came after so many endings. To survive in such a place was to live always in the shadow of those who had not survived, to know always how easily she might join them, to carry the weight of that knowledge through all her years as queen. Survival was not a simple triumph, but a complex and costly thing, bought with sacrifice and vigilance and the constant nearness of death, and she bore its costs as she bore everything. dignity and courage and a steady strength. She was the one who survived, and she earned that survival, paid for it in full, with the renunciation of her happiness and the labour of her vigilance and the weight of all she had outlived. And then, having paid so much for her survival, having earned her freedom at such cost, she lost it all anyway to the childbed fever in the very moment of her reward. There is no neat lesson in that, no tidy moral, only the deep and complicated truth of a remarkable life, lived with courage, ended in sorrow, worthy of our admiration and our compassion both. It is worth asking how Catherine has been remembered in the centuries since her death, for the way history has treated her tells us something about the world and about her, and there is an injustice in it that is worth setting right. For a long time, Catherine was the least remembered of the 6 wives, the one who attracted the least attention, the least drama, the least interest. The others had their vivid stories, their tragedies and scandals that caught the imagination and held it down the centuries. Catherine of Aragon had her long and dramatic struggle against her rejection. Anne Boleyn had her spectacular rise and her terrible fall. Jane Seymour had her death in giving the king his heir. Anne of Cleves had the comedy of the rejected bride. Catherine Howard had her youthful tragedy. And Catherine Parr had, in the popular memory, only the single word, survived, a kind of footnote, the wife who did not provide a dramatic ending, who simply outlived the king and then died quietly 2 years later. Yet, this is a real injustice, for as we have seen, Catherine was in many ways the most remarkable of the 6, the most accomplished, the most fully realized as a person in her own right. The very thing that made her less memorable, her survival, the absence of a dramatic tragic ending, obscured the genuine remarkableness of her life, the learning and the courage and the capability that set her so far apart. Because she did not die spectacularly, because her story did not end in scandal or the scaffold, she was overlooked, reduced to a footnote, remembered only for not dying. The drama of the others drew the eye, while the quieter but deeper distinction of Catherine, her scholarship, her writing, her courage, her competence, her influence on the future of England, went largely unnoticed. The wife who deserved most to be remembered for her own qualities was remembered least, precisely because her qualities were of a kind that did not make for vivid legend. But in more recent times, Catherine has begun to receive the attention she deserves, as historians and readers have looked again at her life and recognized its real distinction. The recognition of her as the first Englishwoman to publish under her own name has drawn attention to her importance in the history of women's writing. The study of her convictions of faith and her part in the Reformation has revealed her significance in the bitter religious struggle of her age. The appreciation of her influence on Elizabeth has highlighted her part in the making of England's greatest queen, and the full appreciation of her character, her courage and capability and learning, has begun to give her the place she deserves among the remarkable women of her age, not a mere footnote, not just the one who survived, but a figure of real importance and real distinction in her own right. The injustice of her long neglect is slowly being corrected, and she is emerging, at last, as the extraordinary woman she truly was. There is something fitting in this slow recovery of her reputation, this gradual recognition of her true worth, for it mirrors the quiet way she lived and worked. She was never one for dramatic gestures or spectacular acts, but worked calmly and steadily through the channels available to her, achieving much without grand display. Her achievements were of a quiet kind, the writing of books, the education of children, the careful management of danger, the steady exercise of capability, and they did not blaze across the sky like the dramas of the other wives, but accumulated, quietly, into a life of genuine and lasting significance. It is fitting, then, that her recognition should come gently too, not in a sudden blaze of fame, but in a gradual and growing appreciation, as more and more people look at her life and see, at last, how remarkable it was. The unassuming woman of true worth is being quietly recognized at last, and that is, as it should be, the slow correction of a long injustice, the giving to Catherine, 5 centuries too late, of the place she always deserved among the most admirable figures of her remarkable age. If we seek the thread that runs through the whole of Catherine's remarkable life, the single quality that underlay all her achievements and sustained her through all her trials, we find it, I think, in her faith, for Catherine was, above all things, a woman of deep and serious religious conviction, and her faith was the wellspring from which everything else flowed. It was her faith that drove her writing, for her books were works of devotion, expressions of her spiritual journey, the fruit of her religious reflection. It was her faith that placed her in such danger, for her reforming convictions made her the target of the conservative faction and nearly led her to the stake. It was her faith that sustained her through her trials, that gave her the strength to endure her dutiful marriages and her perilous queenship, that she understood her very sacrifices as obedience to God's will. And it was her faith that she carried to the end, dying, by the accounts that survive, for commending her soul to God, facing death with the same conviction that had shaped her life. Faith was the centre of Catherine, the thing from which all the rest proceeded, and to understand her we must understand that she was, before and beneath everything else, a deeply religious woman. And here we touch the heart of what made her faith remarkable. It was not merely its content, but its courage, the willingness to hold and to act upon convictions that might have killed her. It is one thing to believe. It is quite another to believe boldly, in the teeth of mortal danger, when silence and conformity would have kept one perfectly safe. Catherine could so easily have chosen the safe path, the outward show of orthodoxy that cost nothing and risked nothing. That she did not, that she let her faith shape her actions and accepted the peril that came with it, tells us something essential about the steel beneath her gentleness. There was nothing timid in her devotion, nothing merely comfortable or conventional. It was a faith that had counted the cost and was prepared to pay it, the faith of someone who would rather be true than be safe. And that quality of conviction, that readiness to stake everything on what she held to be right, is among the very finest things in her, and it sat, unbroken, at the very core of who she was. And yet her faith was joined, remarkably, with a practical wisdom and a worldly cleverness that allowed her to survive the perils her convictions created. And this combination of deep faith and shrewd judgment is one of the most striking things about her character. She was devout, but not naive, principled, but not foolish, committed to her faith, but also clever enough to navigate the deadly perils that her faith created. When the heresy plot threatened her, she did not go meekly to her destruction as a martyr, but used her wit and her judgment to save herself, performing the brilliant submission that turned aside the threat. She combined, in other words, the deep conviction of the believer with the practical cleverness of the survivor, holding firmly to her faith while shrewdly managing the perils it created. And it was this rare combination that allowed her both to serve her God faithfully and to live to serve him longer. Lesser women might have had the faith without the cleverness and been destroyed, or the cleverness without the faith and been merely worldly. Catherine had both, the profound faith and the shrewd judgment, and the joining of them made her the extraordinary woman she was. In the end, it is this wholeness of character that most distinguishes Catherine, this integration of so many qualities that are rarely found together, the learning and the faith, the courage and the cleverness, the conviction and the prudence, the seriousness and the warmth. She was a scholar and a believer, a survivor and a martyr in waiting who lived, a woman of deep principle and shrewd judgment, of intellectual seriousness and human warmth, of spiritual conviction and practical wisdom. She held all these things together in a single character, balanced and whole, and that wholeness is perhaps the truest measure of her distinction, the reason she stands out so clearly among the six, and indeed among the women of her age. She was not a creature of a single quality, defined by one trait or one relationship, but a fully realized human being, complex and integrated and complete, a woman of many gifts held in a rare balance. And at the center of that balance, holding it all together, was her faith, the deep conviction that gave her life its meaning and its direction, that drove her achievements and sustained her trials, and that she carried unbroken to the very end. She was, take her all in all, a whole and exceptional woman, and the wholeness began and ended in her faith. There is one more aspect of Catherine's remarkable character that deserves our attention before we let her story settle toward its close, and that is her warmth, her kindness, the human tenderness that ran beneath all her learning, and her courage and her capability, for she was not merely an admirable woman, but a deeply likable one, loved by those who knew her. It would be easy in cataloguing her accomplishments, her scholarship and her statecraft and her nerve, to lose sight of the simpler human qualities that made her so dear to those around her, the kindness and the generosity that won her affection wherever she went. But these qualities were as much a part of her as her learning, and perhaps more important to those who lived alongside her, for it was her kindness as much as her wisdom that made her so good a stepmother, so good a mistress to her household, so good a friend to those who served and knew her. Consider how she was loved by the children she gathered into her care, the damaged Mary and the watchful Elizabeth, and the precious Edward. For it was not her learning that won their hearts, but the maternal warmth she brought to young ones who had known too little of it. She gave them what they most needed, which was not instruction but affection, the tenderness of a mother for children who had lost their mothers, the family feeling for a family that had been broken, and they responded to it, loving her in return, the lonely young drawn to what she offered, finding in her the affection that their strange and damaged lives had so often lacked. It was her heart as much as her head that healed that broken family, her capacity for love as much as her capacity for thought, and the children who passed through her care carried with them surely the memory of the kindness she had shown them, the tenderness of the stepmother who had cherished them when they most needed it. Consider, too, how she was loved by those who served her, the ladies and attendants about her, who gave her not just the duty their positions required, but a heartfelt devotion and affection. She was a kind mistress, considerate and generous, treating those who served her with a kindness and a respect that won their loyalty and their love. She gathered around her a household that was bound by genuine affection, not merely by duty, a circle of women who loved and admired their mistress and served her with devotion. And this capacity to inspire love, to draw genuine affection from those around her, was one of her most attractive qualities, the human warmth that made her not just respected, but beloved, not just admired, but dear. The accounts of those who knew her speak again and again of her kindness, her generosity, her gentleness, the qualities that made her so good to be near, and they remind us that beneath all her accomplishments, she was, simply, a kind and warm and loving human being. It is this combination, finally, of greatness and goodness, of accomplishment and kindness, that makes Catherine so wholly admirable, for she was not one of those formidable figures whom we respect but cannot warm to, nor one of those gentle souls whom we love but cannot quite respect. She was both the learned scholar and the loving stepmother, the courageous survivor and the kind mistress, the capable stateswoman and the warm human heart, joining greatness and goodness in a single character that commands both our admiration and our affection. And perhaps that is the truest reason that her story moves us so, that we do not only respect her achievements, but cherish her for her warmth, that she is not a distant figure of accomplishment, but a near and human one of kindness, a woman we would have been glad to know, glad to serve, glad to call a friend. She was great, and she was good, and the joining of the two in her is what makes her, at the last, not merely the most accomplished of the 6 wives, but the most lovable, the one whom we close the book upon with not only admiration, but affection, wishing her well across the centuries, glad that such a woman lived, sorry that she died so soon, grateful for the warmth and the light that she brought into her hard and dangerous age. And so we come to the question of what we are to make of her. When we look at the long arc that we have followed tonight, from the northern schoolroom to the chapel at Sudeley, the old rhyme gives her one word, and that word is true as far as it goes, but how thin it is, how nearly empty, set against the life we have come to know. To remember her only as the one who did not die is to remember almost nothing of her, to let the single fact of her endurance eclipse everything that endurance was for. For she did not simply outlast Henry. She thought and wrote and governed. She believed and dared and very nearly burned for it. She loved a difficult family back into a single household, and she touched, through the children she raised, the future course of her country. She reached at the very last, after a happiness of her own, and held it for one brief season before it was taken from her. What strikes one, looking back across it all, is how completely she belonged to herself, how little she was defined by the man she married, and how much by her own mind and heart and will. She was the least diminished of the 6, the one who, even inside that most overshadowing of marriages, remained unmistakably and entirely a person in her own right. And that, more than her survival, is what we should carry away from her, the sense of a complete and remarkable human being who lived against every pressure to be less, fully, as herself. And so the candles are burning low, and Catherine's long and remarkable story is told, all the way from the northern schoolroom to the still chapel at Sudeley where she sleeps, and there is nothing left to do tonight but let it settle, and carry the gentlest part of it with you down into sleep. Carry the picture of her at her best, the learned woman with her books, the loving stepmother gathering the broken young ones into the warmth of a real family, the clever queen turning aside her enemies with nothing but her wit, the woman who governed a kingdom and wrote her own books and faced down the most perilous man alive and survived, and carry too the gentler truth at the heart of her story, that she did her duty faithfully through long hard years, and was rewarded at the last, however briefly, with the love and the child she had always longed for, and that even her sorrowful ending cannot quite cancel the lasting worth of her life. She was the one who survived, and more than that, who lived a full and remarkable and accomplished life, and who deserves to be remembered not as a footnote to a king, but as one of the most admirable women of her age. Let her rest now, in her still chapel in the green Gloucestershire hills, the scholar and the survivor, the last and the finest of the 6. If you have found something restful here tonight, in this slow and gentle walk through a life lived so long ago, then you are very welcome to subscribe before you go, so that the next of these long evenings finds its way to you when you have need of one. Wherever you are in the world tonight, and whatever the hour, I hope the dark is kind to you, and the bed is warm, and the morning, when it comes, is gentle. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.